On my 26th birthday, I walked into my own bedroom and caught my husband tangled in the sheets with my maid of honor. 6 years later, at my cousin's lavish wedding reception, that same ex-husband blocked my path, smirking as he looked me up and down. "Leaving you was the best decision I ever made," he sneered. Before I could respond, a 5-year-old boy in a custom tuxedo broke through the crowd, wrapped his arms around my legs, and yelled, "Mommy, I found you!" Right behind him, the heavy oak doors of the ballroom swung open, and the room went dead silent. My name is Madeline. I am 32 years old, and I am the director of acquisitions at one of the most ruthless venture capital firms on the East Coast. But to my toxic family, I am just the eternal disappointment. Before I continue this story and reveal exactly who walked through those doors, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever had to build your own empire while your family prayed for your downfall. The crystal chandeliers of the Plaza Hotel ballroom cast a warm golden glow over my cousin Brittany's wedding reception, but the atmosphere immediately around me was freezing cold. I had barely stepped a foot past the velvet ropes holding a glass of sparkling water when my path was deliberately and aggressively blocked. Bradley stood there swirling a glass of expensive bourbon. At 33, his hairline was already receding, though he still carried himself with the unearned arrogance of a tech startup founder who believed he was the smartest man in the room. He was currently bleeding cash and desperate for funding, but his ego remained completely unchecked. Clinging to his arm like a decorative accessory was Courtney. She was heavily pregnant with their second child, her manicured hand resting performatively on her swollen belly. Seeing the woman who used to be my absolute best friend, the woman who completely destroyed my marriage on my own birthday, standing there wearing a diamond ring, bought with money I had helped Bradley save, used to make my chest burn with white-hot rage. Now it just made me exhausted. "Well, well," Bradley said, his voice dripping with condescension as he looked me up and down. His gaze took in my tailored emerald green evening gown, completely missing the fact that it was vintage couture worth more than his failing company's monthly payroll. "Looking as pathetic as you did 6 years ago. I see you still have not figured out how to move on." He leaned in closer, his bourbon-soaked breath hitting my face. "Leaving you was the best decision I ever made." Courtney let out a high-pitched, mocking laugh, leaning her head against his shoulder. "Oh, Bradley, leave her alone. It must be so hard for Madeline to be here today, surrounded by happy couples and growing families. We should be sensitive to her tragic situation." Before I could tell Courtney to save her fake pity, the sharp, rapid clack of designer heels approached from my left. My mother, Patricia, and my older sister, Rachel, materialized out of the wedding crowd. They moved with that synchronized, predatory grace they always used when they found a vulnerable target. I braced myself, a foolish, lingering part of my inner child, hoping my mother would reprimand Bradley for his blatant disrespect. Instead, Patricia did not even acknowledge his cruelty. She looked right past him and focused her piercing, relentless judgment entirely on me, Madeline. Patricia sighed dramatically, reaching out to adjust the strap of my gown with a rough, critical tug. "Could you really not find a more suitable dress for a formal family occasion? You look so incredibly underwhelming. Just look at Courtney." She gestured warmly toward the very woman who had ruined my 20s. "Courtney is absolutely glowing. She is carrying her second child, building a beautiful family for Bradley, while you are 32 and still showing up to family events completely empty-handed." Rachel, the family chief financial officer, and my parents' undisputed golden child stepped forward with a champagne flute tight in her grip. At 34, she wore her superiority like a heavy cloak. She looked me over with an expression of pure, unfiltered disgust. "It is embarrassing, Mom," Rachel said loudly, deliberately, projecting her voice to ensure the nearby guests could hear every single word. "She is our socially unfit spinster. We practically had to beg her to come tonight so people would not ask uncomfortable questions about the broken branch of our family tree. I guess working long hours at whatever little office job she has does not leave time for fixing a massive personality defect." The sheer audacity of the coordinated attack was breathtaking. My mother was openly praising the mistress who destroyed my marriage, while my sister, who I knew for an absolute fact was drowning in her own secret financial chaos, was loudly branding me a socially unfit spinster in a room full of our relatives. They expected me to shrink. They expected me to lower my eyes to apologize for existing, to run to the restroom in tears, just like I would have done 6 years ago. They fed on my insecurity like parasites, needing me to be small so they could feel large. But I was no longer the weak, people-pleasing girl they remembered. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice in defense. I simply took a slow, deliberate sip of my sparkling water and smiled a faint, razor-sharp smile. I looked past Bradley's receding hairline, past Courtney's smug, punchable face, and past my mother's fiercely disapproving glare. "What are you smiling at?" Rachel snapped, her irritation immediately flaring at my lack of submission. "You think this is funny?" I did not answer her. My attention was strictly fixed on the heavy brass-handled mahogany doors at the far end of the ballroom. A hush was already rippling through the outer edges of the crowd, heads turning, conversations dropping to panicked whispers as the grand, heavy oak doors began to swing wide open to reveal exactly who had arrived. The crisp Sunday morning air bit at my skin as I parked my car in the sprawling, circular driveway of my parents' Connecticut estate. Less than 12 hours had passed since the reception, and my phone had been vibrating relentlessly since dawn. The frantic voicemails from my father, Richard, had not contained a single question about my new husband or my newly revealed stepson. Instead, they were strictly orders to present myself at the family home immediately. I walked through the massive double front doors, the familiar scent of lemon polish and expensive floral arrangements instantly suffocating me. The housekeeper directed me toward my father's private mahogany-paneled study. I pushed the heavy door open and stepped onto the Persian rug. Richard was already pacing behind his massive desk, his face flushed a dangerous shade of crimson. Patricia sat perfectly still in a wingback leather chair, sipping her morning tea with calculated precision. Before I could even offer a greeting, Richard slammed his hands flat against the polished wood of his desk. "You are a selfish, spiteful woman, Madeline." His voice echoed off the high ceilings, vibrating with unchecked rage. I stood my ground, my expression completely blank. He marched around the desk, pointing a trembling finger at my face. "You planned that entire spectacle just to humiliate Courtney and Bradley on their special day. You paraded that man and that child into the ballroom specifically to upstage the bride. You could not stand seeing your sister and your former best friend happy, so you orchestrated a disgusting stunt to draw all the attention to your own pathetic life." The sheer delusion of his accusation hung heavily in the air. He was completely ignoring the reality that Alexander was a venture capital titan, a man whose net worth dwarfed our entire family lineage. He was bypassing the fact that Bradley had initiated the conflict. To Richard, I was simply the villain who had ruined the aesthetic of the wedding photos. I watched him rant, feeling nothing but a cold, clinical detachment. Patricia set her teacup down with a sharp porcelain clink. She smoothed the front of her cashmere cardigan and offered me a smile that lacked any genuine warmth. "Your father is right, Madeline. What you did last night was unforgivable. You brought shame to this family. You made Courtney cry on what should have been the happiest night of her life. Bradley was so distraught he had to leave his own reception early. We spent hours doing damage control with the guests. I remained silent, waiting for the inevitable trap to spring. They never summoned me just to yell. There was always a transaction involved." Patricia reached into the embossed leather folder, resting on the table beside her. She pulled out a thick stack of legal documents, bound with a heavy brass clip, and slid them across the expansive mahogany surface until they rested right in front of me. "We have spent the entire morning consulting with the family attorneys," she said smoothly. "Since you clearly have no respect for family loyalty, we have decided to give you a chance to make amends, to prove that you actually care about the damage you caused." I looked down at the documents, then back up at my mother. "What is this?" I asked, my voice devoid of emotion. "It is a transfer of assets," Richard snapped, stepping back behind his desk. "You currently hold a 5% share in the family trust. A share you have done absolutely nothing to earn. You are going to sign those shares over to Bradley and Courtney today. We are framing it legally as a belated wedding gift. It is the only appropriate compensation for your embarrassing behavior last night. It will help them secure the funding Bradley needs for his startup, and it will serve as your formal apology for trying to ruin their wedding. The sheer audacity of the demand was almost impressive. They were attempting to extort my birthright to fund my ex-husband's failing company, all under the guise of an apology for a conflict I did not even start. They were leveraging my supposed guilt to secure Bradley's financial future. I picked up the heavy brass pen, resting beside the contract, feeling the cold metal against my fingers. I flipped to the first page, scanning the dense legal jargon. It was an ironclad transfer, completely stripping me of my ties to the trust, and handing the keys directly to the man who had betrayed me. "You will sign it right now," Richard demanded, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. "If you refuse, we will publicly cut you out of this family. We will make sure everyone in our social circle knows exactly how unstable and vindictive you are. We will isolate you completely." I held the pen, staring at the signature line. The room was tense, the silence heavy with their anticipation. They thought they had backed me into a corner. They thought my lifelong desire for their approval would force my hand. Just as Patricia opened her mouth to issue another threat, the study doors clicked open. Dominic stepped into the room. He was Rachel's husband, an African-American man with a sharp analytical mind and a highly successful career as a former state prosecutor. Dominic usually stayed as far away from the family crossfire as possible, maintaining a polite but distant demeanor during these toxic gatherings. Today, he was dressed in a crisp weekend suit, carrying a silver carafe of fresh coffee. He did not say a word to Richard or Patricia. He walked smoothly toward the side console, moving with a deliberate, unhurried grace. As he passed behind my chair, I felt a sudden shift in the air. He leaned forward slightly, reaching across me to place a fresh coffee cup on the desk. For a fraction of a second, Dominic made direct eye contact with me. His dark eyes were intense, carrying a silent, urgent warning. He adjusted his grip on the silver carafe, and as he pulled his arm back, his elbow caught the edge of a thick, unmarked manila folder tucked under his arm. The folder slipped. It fell directly onto my lap, the clasp popping open upon impact. A cascade of highly confidential financial dossiers spilled across my pleated skirt. The documents were marked with bright red auditing stamps and urgent bank notices. I looked down at the papers, my eyes instantly catching a string of catastrophic negative numbers highlighted in bold ink. Dominic murmured a quiet apology, but he did not reach down to retrieve the file. He simply stood back, leaving the explosive truth resting right in the palm of my hands. The glossy pages resting on my pleated skirt immediately commanded my attention. Dominic bent down with practiced slowness to retrieve the spilled coffee carafe, his broad shoulders shielding my lap from Richard and Patricia's line of sight, just long enough for me to read the bold, glaring red text. It was an official notice of federal tax liens and a complete internal ledger of the family trust. The numbers did not lie. Rachel, the self-proclaimed financial genius of the family, had been systematically bleeding the accounts dry for the last 4 years. She had funneled cash into shell companies and failed real estate flips, leaving the once massive trust completely hollowed out. Worse, she had ignored the corporate tax obligations. The family trust was currently saddled with a toxic, inescapable $2 million debt to the IRS. I glanced back at the heavy legal contract my mother had just slid across the mahogany desk. It was labeled as a simple deed of gift for Bradley and Courtney. However, skimming the fine print beneath the signature line, the trap became glaringly obvious. The document was carefully worded to separate the trust's liabilities from its assets. By signing it as presented, I would be legally gifting my clean 5% equity to my ex-husband and his new wife, while simultaneously assuming full personal responsibility for the outstanding corporate debt. They were trying to bankrupt me to save themselves and reward the man who broke my heart. Before I could flip to the final page, the heavy study doors burst open again. Rachel stormed into the room, her designer heels striking the floorboards like weaponized hammers. She took one look at Dominic, then at the scattered papers on my lap and all the color drained from her perfectly contoured face. She lunged forward, snatching the confidential dossier right out of my hands with a frantic animalistic gasp. Dominic simply stood up, offered a polite nod, and exited the room without a single word, leaving the door clicking shut behind him. Rachel slammed her palms down onto the mahogany desk, leaning over it to glare at me with absolute venom. Her panic instantly morphed into unhinged aggression. "You are going to sign that contract right this second, Madeline." Rachel hissed, her voice vibrating with desperate rage. "You owe us. You humiliated this family last night with your ridiculous stunt. You think because you snagged Alexander that you are suddenly untouchable. You think his elite old money family will tolerate a scandal." Patricia immediately flanked her golden child, crossing her arms tightly. "You will do your duty to this family, Madeline. Bradley needs that clean equity to save his startup. If you refuse to sign," Rachel continued, her eyes wide and manic, "I will personally call every media contact I have. I will leak fabricated stories about your past mental instability. I will brand you a manipulative, calculating gold digger who trapped Alexander with a staged pregnancy scare. I will completely destroy your reputation in high society before your new marriage even gets off the ground. You will sign over the clean equity and you will absorb the trust penalties as your penance. Sign the paper, Madeline." I sat perfectly still in the high-backed leather chair. The sheer desperation radiating from my sister was palpable. She was cornered, staring down the barrel of federal tax evasion, and her only way out was to use me as a human shield. Richard stood behind the desk, nodding along with Rachel's threats, completely ignorant to the fact that his favorite daughter had already bankrupted him. They all believed they held the ultimate leverage. They believed the threat of an aristocratic scandal would force me into panicked submission. Instead of arguing, I let a chilling, compliant smile spread across my face. "You are absolutely right, Rachel," I said, my voice smooth and dangerously calm. "Family duty is everything. I would hate to cause any more embarrassment after last night." I reached out and picked up the heavy brass pen. Patricia let out a loud, dramatic sigh of relief while Richard muttered something about me finally showing some maturity. Rachel watched me like a hawk, her chest heaving as she waited for her salvation. I pulled the deed of gift toward me. Without breaking eye contact with my sister, I deliberately flipped to the liability addendum. With 3 swift, heavy strokes of the brass pen, I completely crossed out the clause assigning the trust's debt to me. In the blank margin, I wrote a legally binding addendum explicitly transferring my entire 5% share directly to Bradley and Courtney, inclusive of all attached liens, liabilities, and outstanding federal tax debts. I initialed the correction, flipped to the back page, and signed my name with a flourish. I stood up, sliding the modified contract across the desk toward my father. "It is done," I announced softly. "Bradley and Courtney are now the proud sole owners of my entire share of the family trust. I wish them all the luck in the world with their new assets." Richard eagerly snatched the document, completely ignoring the bold ink corrections I had just made in the margins. He was too blinded by his own victory to read the fine print. Patricia was already walking toward the crystal bar cart in the corner of the room, pulling a chilled bottle of vintage champagne from the silver bucket. Rachel stared at me, her eyes narrowing in momentary confusion, but the sheer relief of securing my signature overrode her usual sharp instincts. She believed she had won. She believed she had successfully dumped her $2 million felony onto my shoulders. I turned my back on them and walked toward the mahogany doors. As I gripped the brass handle, the loud celebratory pop of the champagne cork echoed through the study. My parents were cheering, toasting to Bradley's future and their own perceived cleverness. I stepped out into the grand hallway and pulled the door shut behind me, leaving my family blissfully, arrogantly unaware that they had just handed Bradley and Courtney a financial death sentence. Exactly 3 weeks passed before the champagne bubbles of my family's celebration turned into pure acid. The Internal Revenue Service moves with a terrifying mechanical efficiency when dealing with high net worth tax evasion. The moment the legal transfer of my 5% trust share was processed and authenticated, the toxic $2 million debt attached itself directly to Bradley and Courtney. Bradley had eagerly signed the acceptance forms, completely blinded by his own greed and Richard's congratulations. He never once bothered to read the fine print or my heavily initialed addendum. The financial shockwave hit his tech startup like a runaway freight train. His company was already bleeding cash, operating on incredibly thin margins and heavily inflated venture capital promises. When the federal asset freezes were officially initiated, his payroll accounts were locked overnight. His business credit lines were instantly frozen, and his vendors began demanding immediate cash payments. The startup he had constantly bragged about at the wedding reception was suddenly facing imminent catastrophic bankruptcy. Desperation makes arrogant men highly predictable. Bradley needed an immediate, massive capital injection just to unlock his frozen accounts and keep his doors open. That sheer desperation drove him straight out of Boston and onto a first-class flight to Silicon Valley. He was chasing a lifeline from the very venture capital firm he had been trying to court for the past 8 months. He thought he was walking into a standard pitch meeting. He thought he was going to save his empire. My corner office on the top floor of our Palo Alto headquarters was a masterpiece of modern corporate intimidation. The expansive space featured floor-to-ceiling glass walls that offered a sweeping, unobstructed view of the valley below. The furniture was stark and minimalist, consisting of a massive slab of polished slate that served as my desk and a high-backed black leather executive chair. I sat facing the glass, looking out over the sprawling tech campuses, waiting patiently for the trap to spring. My assistant had notified me 10 minutes earlier that the founder of an aggressively pitching startup had arrived for his scheduled meeting with the director of acquisitions. I could hear Bradley long before I could see him. His loud, overly confident voice echoed through the pristine white hallway as he swaggered toward my office. He was loudly lecturing one of our junior associates about market disruption and his visionary leadership capabilities. He was desperately trying to project an aura of massive, untouchable success to completely mask the terrifying reality of his frozen bank accounts. He expected to walk into this room, charm some faceless corporate executive with meaningless buzzwords, and walk out with a multi-million-dollar check that would magically erase the horrific financial mess my family had dumped on him. The heavy glass door to my office clicked open and then shut with a soft thud. I waited until I heard the distinct sound of his leather briefcase hitting the slate desk before I slowly spun my chair around. Bradley had an arrogant, practiced smile plastered across his face, his hand already extended for a firm, confident handshake. The exact second his eyes locked onto mine, that smile completely disintegrated. The color drained out of his face so rapidly he looked physically ill. His extended hand dropped awkwardly to his side, twitching violently. For a long, agonizing moment, the silence in the room was absolute and heavy. Madeline. He finally choked out, his voice cracking under the weight of his utter confusion. What are you doing in this office? I folded my hands perfectly on top of the slate desk and looked at him with an expression of mild professional curiosity. I am the Director of Acquisitions, Bradley. You are here to pitch me. The sheer confusion in his eyes rapidly morphed into a chaotic, explosive rage. The realization that his financial salvation rested entirely in the hands of the woman he had viciously mocked and abandoned completely shattered his fragile ego. His face flushed a dark, furious crimson. The polished professional demeanor he had walked in with vanished, replaced by the ugly, entitled temper I remembered all too well from our doomed marriage. You have got to be kidding me! Bradley snapped, his voice rising to a frantic, echoing shout. There is absolutely no way you hold this position. You slept your way into this chair. You probably seduced some board member just to orchestrate this entire setup to get back at me. This is a sick joke. I remained perfectly still in my chair, refusing to validate his pathetic tantrum with any emotional response. My complete silence only infuriated him more. He slammed his fist down hard on my desk, leaning over the polished slate with wild, unhinged eyes. I am not pitching anything to you. I will sue this entire firm for a massive conflict of interest. I will call the Better Business Bureau. I will call my lawyers and ruin your career before the day is over. You are nothing but a vindictive, bitter ex-wife trying to ruin my life because you could not keep me." He continued screaming his empty threats, echoing loudly off the thick glass walls, completely consumed by his own desperate fury. He was so busy throwing his childish tantrum and pointing fingers that he did not hear the heavy office door swing open behind him. He did not hear the quiet, measured footsteps crossing the carpeted room. Alexander stepped into the bright light of the office, his presence instantly dropping the temperature in the room to freezing. He was dressed in a sharp, dark suit, his expression completely devoid of any emotion. Alexander completely ignored Bradley's frantic screaming. He did not even acknowledge the man's existence. Without uttering a single word, Alexander moved smoothly to the front of the desk and dropped a thick, heavy stack of finalized legal documents right in front of Bradley's pale, sweating face. The heavy thud of the paper against the slate desk echoed like a gavel striking a sound block, instantly snapping Bradley's hysterical tirade in half. He jumped, his bourbon-scented sweat now visible under the harsh modern lighting of the boardroom. Alexander did not look at him. He bypassed the sputtering man entirely and moved to stand directly behind my executive chair, his large hands resting lightly on my shoulders, in a silent display of absolute, unshakable solidarity. The power dynamic in the room shifted so violently that the air actually felt thin. "The acquisition papers," Darling Alexander said, his deep voice smooth and entirely devoid of the frantic tension Bradley was bleeding into the room. "Our legal team just finalized the hostile takeover parameters." I smiled, reaching forward to deliberately untie the red string binding the thick legal bundle. Bradley's eyes darted frantically between Alexander and me, his mouth opening and closing as he struggled to comprehend the words "hostile takeover." He lunged toward the desk, grabbing the top sheet with trembling fingers. His eyes scanned the bold lettering, and I watched the exact second his brain processed the catastrophic reality of his situation. All the remaining color drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, translucent gray. "You see, Bradley?" I began my tone conversational, as if we were discussing the mild California weather, when my parents so generously forced me to transfer my 5% share of the family trust to you. They inadvertently handed you a poisoned chalice. That specific share carried a $2 million federal tax lien, courtesy of my sister Rachel's highly illegal fraudulent real estate ventures. He staggered backward, the heavy cream-colored paper shaking violently in his hands. "No, that is a complete lie." Richard assured me the equity was clean. "I used that equity to secure a massive bridge loan last week to keep my servers running." "Exactly," I replied, leaning forward and resting my elbows on the polished slate desk. "You used intensely toxic assets to collateralize a federal business loan. You were so eager to take my money, so utterly desperate to save your failing company, that you signed the transfer papers without conducting a single shred of due diligence. The moment the Internal Revenue Service flagged the transfer and attached the lien to your name, your bridge loan was immediately recalled. You defaulted on Friday at exactly 5 in the afternoon. But do not worry, my husband's firm graciously stepped in to purchase your distressed debt from the bank." Alexander finally turned his cold, predatory gaze to the crumbling man before us. "My firm monitors all major tech debt in this valley, Bradley. When your primary creditors panicked, they were desperate to offload your toxic portfolio. I bought your entire corporate debt for exactly 12 cents on the dollar. You do not own your startup anymore. My firm owns your intellectual property, your office leases your server farms, and your payroll accounts. We are liquidating the company effective immediately. The documents you are holding are simply your formal eviction notices." Bradley shook his head, his breathing shallow and rapid. "You cannot do this. I have private investors. I have revolutionary code. My technology is worth millions." "Your code is outdated derivative garbage," Alexander replied. His tone so flat and clinical it was utterly devastating. "We did not buy your debt to acquire your technology. We bought your debt specifically to dismantle your company, fire your board of directors, and sell your hardware for scrap metal to recoup our 12 cents. You own absolutely nothing. You do not even own the expensive leather chair you were sitting in 10 minutes ago." Just then, Bradley's phone began to vibrate violently against the surface of my desk. The screen lit up, flashing Courtney's name in bright letters. I nodded toward the glowing screen, my expression perfectly serene. You should probably answer that. I imagine she is quite upset about the bank foreclosing on your primary residence. He snatched the phone, his hands shaking so violently he almost dropped it onto the floor. He pressed accept and put it on speaker, his chest heaving. Courtney's voice instantly filled the pristine boardroom, shrill, terrified, and weeping uncontrollably. Bradley, you need to come home right now, she sobbed, the sound of heavy footsteps echoing in the background of her call. There are men in dark suits at the house. They are locking the front gates. They said our personal accounts are completely frozen and we have 72 hours to vacate the premises. They are towing my Mercedes from the driveway right now. What did you do, Bradley? What is happening to us? He hung up the phone, completely unable to form a single coherent response to his pregnant wife. The arrogant, untouchable tech founder who had smirked at me during the wedding reception, who had proudly paraded his mistress in front of my face and mocked my existence, evaporated into thin air. He was replaced by a pathetic hollow shell of a man. His knees buckled, hitting the plush corporate carpet with a soft thud. He was literally kneeling on the floor of my office. Madeline, please! He begged, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, desperate whine. You cannot do this to me. Courtney is pregnant with our second child. We will have absolutely nothing. I will lose everything I have ever worked for. Just give me the company back. I will sign whatever you want. I will publicly apologize. Please just make this stop. I looked down at him, searching my soul for even a fraction of pity, but I found absolutely nothing. I thought back to the night I caught him tangled in my bed sheets, the agonizing divorce, the years of subtle insults from my family, and the way he had blocked my path just weeks ago to sneer at my pain. You took everything from me on my 26th birthday, I stated coldly, my voice ringing with total finality. You laughed when I walked out the door with nothing but a single suitcase. You made your choices, Bradley. Now you get to live with the consequences of your own unchecked greed. I reached out and pressed the silver intercom button on my desk. Security, please escort the former chief executive officer of TechFlow out of the building. He is trespassing on our property. Two towering security guards in crisp dark suits entered the boardroom immediately. They hauled Bradley to his feet by his armpits. He was too stunned, too utterly defeated by the total annihilation of his life to even attempt to fight back. He went completely limp, his eyes wide and vacant, as they dragged him out through the heavy glass doors, his expensive leather shoes dragging uselessly against the carpet. Alexander reached down, taking my hand and pulling me gently to my feet. He guided me toward the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the sprawling, sun-baked Palo Alto Tech campus below. We stood side by side in comfortable silence, watching as the security guards practically tossed Bradley onto the hot pavement outside the main entrance. He stood there for a long time, staring up at the towering glass monolith, a man who had tried to play a billionaire's game and had his entire existence incinerated in the process. I turned away from the window, resting my head against Alexander's chest, listening to the steady, calming rhythm of his heartbeat. Bradley is finished, I murmured, a deep sense of closure washing over me. But my parents and Rachel are still out there in Boston, arrogantly believing they outsmarted everyone. Alexander pressed a lingering kiss to my hair, a dark, dangerous smile curving his lips. Then I suppose it is time we return to the East Coast and finalize the rest of the acquisitions. The suffocating quiet was finally broken by the sound of ice clinking against crystal as Bradley's trembling hand betrayed his sheer, unfiltered panic. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing erratically beneath his tight, expensive collar. Mr. Sterling, Bradley finally managed to stammer his voice, a pathetic, reedy squeak that entirely lacked its previous arrogant bravado. I did not realize. Madeline and we have history. I am the founder of Omnitech Solutions. We actually have a pitch meeting scheduled with your associates next Tuesday. I know exactly who you are, Bradley. Alexander interrupted, his tone as smooth and cold as polished glacial ice. He did not raise his voice, yet the sheer unyielding authority in his cadence commanded the absolute attention of every single guest within a 50-foot radius. You are the man who has spent the last 8 months leaving increasingly desperate voicemails with my junior acquisition teams begging for capital to keep your servers running. You are also the man who just had the staggering lack of foresight to openly insult my wife. Bradley flinched as if he had been physically struck across the jaw. It was a misunderstanding. We were just catching up. Madeline knows I have a dry sense of humor. My wife is not an audience for your insecurities. Alexander stated, his grip tightening slightly and reassuringly on my waist. And as for your pitch meeting, consider it permanently cancelled. My firm does not invest in sinking ships captained by men who lack basic emotional intelligence and operational foresight. You are bleeding cash, Bradley. By the end of this fiscal quarter, you will be filing for bankruptcy. Do not ever approach my firm or my family again. The public financial execution was absolute. The surrounding guests, many of whom were influential investors and local elite socialites, began whispering fiercely among themselves. Bradley's professional reputation was disintegrating in real time, completely incinerated by a single sentence from the most powerful man in the room. Alexander, please, you have to listen. Courtney suddenly interjected, stepping forward with a practiced, sickeningly sweet smile that violently contrasted with the genuine terror reflecting in her eyes. She rested her manicured hand heavily on her pregnant belly, attempting to leverage her maternal state to diffuse the hostility. We were all just joking around. Madeline and I used to be best friends. She knows we have a playful dynamic. We are practically family. I finally stepped forward, moving out of Alexander's protective hold, just enough to look Courtney dead in the eye. I slowly took in her heavily beaded maternity gown and the gaudy diamond ring she had been eagerly flashing in my face mere minutes ago. We stopped being friends, and we certainly stopped being family the exact moment I walked into my own home on my 26th birthday and found you tangled in my marital bed, Courtney. I said, my voice carrying a crystal-clear ringing clarity that silenced the entire perimeter of the ballroom. A collective horrified gasp rippled through the eavesdropping crowd. The string quartet, having tried to awkwardly resume playing, abruptly stopped again. You can keep the ring and you can keep the man. I continued, feeling a profound weight lifting off my shoulders with every syllable. From what Alexander just confirmed about his impending bankruptcy, that diamond is the last piece of genuine collateral you will ever own. Courtney's jaw dropped, her face flushing a mottled, ugly shade of red as she instinctively tried to hide her hand behind her back, shrinking away from the judging stares of the high society guests around her. Seeing the catastrophic social and financial damage unfolding, my mother Patricia immediately shifted tactics. The predatory, mocking matriarch vanished, instantly replaced by a fawning, desperate socialite, eager to align herself with Alexander's unimaginable wealth. Madeline, darling, please. Patricia cooed, stepping forward with her arms outstretched, completely ignoring the fact that she had just called my life empty and underwhelming. Emotions are just running high. Mr. Sterling, I am Patricia, Madeline's mother. We are so absolutely thrilled she has found a man of your incredible stature. We would love to host you both for a private dinner at the estate so we can properly celebrate your union. Rachel, my sister, who had just branded me a socially unfit spinster, nodded vigorously, offering Alexander a blinding, predatory smile. Yes, absolutely. We have always known Madeline was destined for great things. We are so proud of her. The sheer hypocrisy was nauseating. They were pivoting with the seamless sociopathic grace of people who only respected power and money. They expected me to simply fall back into line to offer up my billionaire husband as a trophy for their social climbing. Alexander did not take Patricia's extended hand. He looked at my mother and sister with an expression of profound clinical disgust. I am well aware of how this family operates, Patricia. Alexander said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register that made both women freeze. Madeline has told me everything. I know how you facilitated her isolation, and I know how you actively enabled the very people who betrayed her. You do not get to claim her success now that she wears my name. Alexander pulled a sleek, encrypted smartphone from the inner pocket of his bespoke suit. He looked directly at Rachel, whose fake smile began to violently tremble. And Rachel, Alexander continued, his eyes locking onto my sister's rapidly paling face. Since you are the chief financial officer of the family estate, you should probably check your email. My firm recently acquired the private equity bank that holds the primary mortgage on your parents' estate, as well as the massive undisclosed high-interest personal loans you took out to cover your failed real estate flips. You are over-leveraged by roughly $3 million. Rachel actually staggered backward, the blood draining from her face so fast she looked like a ghost. Patricia gasped loudly, grabbing her pearl necklace, as the illusion of their perfect wealthy existence was publicly shattered in front of their peers. Your loans are currently in default, Alexander stated, coldly delivering the final fatal blow. We will be initiating foreclosure protocols on the family estate on Monday morning. I strongly suggest you spend less time mocking my wife's personality and significantly more time packing your belongings. The absolute devastation was complete. Bradley was staring blankly at the polished marble floor, his career ruined and his startup effectively dead. Courtney was sobbing quietly into her hands, stripped of her stolen social standing. Patricia and Rachel were paralyzed by the horrifying realization that their entire financial safety net had just been legally vaporized by the man they had unknowingly provoked. I looked at the people who had made it their life's mission to make me feel small, insignificant, and unloved. For years, I had craved their validation. Now, looking at their ruined, terrified faces, I felt absolutely no pity, only a profound, liberating emptiness. The heavy, toxic chains of their approval that had bound me for decades were finally broken. I looked down at Leo, who was tugging gently on my hand, completely unfazed by the stunned silence of the surrounding adults. "Can we go get ice cream now, Mommy?" he asked, his bright green eyes looking up at me with pure, innocent adoration. "Yes, sweetie." I smiled, a genuine radiant warmth filling my chest, completely chasing away the coldness of the ballroom. "We can get whatever you want." Alexander wrapped his arms securely around my waist once more, his other hand resting protectively on Leo's shoulder. Without giving my family or my ex-husband another glance, we turned our backs on the wreckage. We walked out through the parting crowd of guests, stepping through the heavy brass-handled doors, leaving the toxic remnants of my past suffocating in the silence of the Grand Hotel, and walked out into the cool evening air and the brilliant, untouchable future we had built together. The cool evening air that had promised an untouchable future felt like a distant memory by the time Thursday rolled around. We had retreated to the absolute sanctuary of Alexander's triplex penthouse, believing the reinforced steel doors and private security detail provided an impenetrable fortress against the desperation of my ruined family. The sprawling living room was bathed in the soft, warm glow of recessed lighting. Leo was sitting on the plush rug, carefully constructing an elaborate castle out of brightly colored magnetic blocks, while Alexander and I sat on the curved sectional, reviewing a few final portfolios. It was a picture of domestic tranquility, a stark contrast to the warfare we had left behind. Our peace shattered with the sharp, unexpected chime of the private express elevator. Alexander frowned instantly, setting his tablet on the glass coffee table. The penthouse elevator required biometric clearance, restricting access to anyone without direct authorization. A heavy, synchronized thud of boots echoed from the marble foyer. Before Alexander could reach the communication panel, the double frosted glass doors separating the foyer from the main living area were forcefully shoved open. 4 individuals marched into our home, instantly suffocating the room with an atmosphere of absolute clinical hostility. 2 of them wore the drab, unremarkable navy windbreakers of state social workers, their expressions locked into masks of professional judgment. Flanking them were 2 fully uniformed city police officers, their hands resting cautiously near their heavy utility belts. I sprang up from the couch, my heart slamming against my ribs with the force of a sledgehammer. My maternal instincts instantly overrode any sense of aristocratic decorum. I lunged across the rug, scooping Leo up into my arms and pulling him flush against my chest. He dropped his magnetic blocks, startled by the sudden commotion, and buried his face into my shoulder, his small hands gripping the fabric of my silk blouse. Alexander stepped directly in front of us, transforming his massive frame into an impenetrable human shield. "Who authorized your access to this floor?" he demanded, his voice a low, lethal rumble that usually sent corporate titans running for cover. "You are trespassing in a private residence." The lead social worker, a tall woman with severe glasses and a thick manila folder clutched to her chest, did not flinch. She stepped forward, flashing a laminated state identification badge. "Mr. Sterling, we are agents with Child Protective Services. We are here executing an emergency wellness check and removal order for Leo Sterling." The words felt like a physical blow to the stomach. The room spun wildly, the edges of my vision blackening with sheer, unadulterated terror. "You are absolutely out of your mind!" I snapped, my voice shaking with a primal defensive fury as I held my son even tighter. "You are not taking my child anywhere. Who sent you?" The second agent pulled a legal document from his jacket. "We received multiple highly coordinated and completely anonymous tips late this afternoon, Mrs. Sterling. These reports detail a severe ongoing pattern of physical and emotional abuse occurring within this household. The informants provided highly specific chronological timelines, floor plans of this exact penthouse, and detailed descriptions of supposed injuries. Due to the extreme graphic nature of these allegations, a judge has granted us temporary emergency custody to remove the child from the premises pending a full state investigation." The absolute cruelty of the strategy hit me with sickening clarity. Courtney and Rachel. They were facing total, inescapable bankruptcy. We had stripped them of their wealth and their social standing. In their unhinged, desperate rage, they had bypassed financial retaliation and aimed directly for the only thing in the world that actually mattered to me. They had weaponized the child welfare system, fabricating a meticulously detailed narrative of abuse to drag my son into the cold machinery of the state. "You are operating on malicious, fabricated slander, manufactured by disgruntled relatives facing federal tax indictments." Alexander stated, his tone dripping with absolute authority. He held his ground. "If you attempt to lay a hand on my son, I will personally ensure your entire department faces a barrage of civil rights lawsuits that will keep you tied up in federal court until you retire." The police officers shifted uncomfortably, recognizing the vast disparity in power, but the lead CPS agent remained completely unmoved. "We have a court-mandated order, Mr. Sterling," she repeated coldly. "Please step aside, or we will have the officers physically detain you for obstructing a state child welfare investigation." I backed away, pressing my shoulders against the cold glass of the floor-to-ceiling windows, shielding Leo's body entirely with my own. "You will have to shoot me before you take him out of this room." The tension in the penthouse was explosive, a powder keg waiting for a single spark. Alexander reached into his pocket to summon our legal team, prepared to unleash a corporate legal war right there in the living room. Just as the police officers unclipped their radios to call for backup, the private elevator chimed a second time. The heavy steel doors slid open and Patricia stepped out into the marble foyer. My mother looked completely disheveled, a masterful theatrical departure from her usual immaculate styling. Her hair was slightly messy, and she wore a plain, understated coat. As she stepped into the living room, tears were already streaming down her cheeks, ruining her carefully applied mascara. She clutched a crumpled tissue in her hands, her shoulders shaking with perfectly orchestrated, agonizing sobs. "Oh, thank God you got here in time!" Patricia cried out, rushing forward to stand directly beside the CPS agents. She looked at me with an expression of profound manufactured tragedy, playing the role of the heartbroken, concerned grandmother with Oscar-worthy precision. "Ma'am, who are you?" the lead police officer asked, holding up a hand to stop her from getting any closer. Patricia let out a ragged, devastated gasp, pressing the tissue to her trembling lips. "I am Madeline's mother." She wept, her voice projecting the exact right amount of maternal despair to captivate the social workers. "I am the one who finally called the authorities. I tried to handle it privately. I truly did. But I could no longer sit by and watch my innocent grandson suffer." My jaw dropped in absolute horror. The betrayal was so profound, so intensely evil, that it temporarily robbed me of oxygen. "She is lying," I screamed, my voice echoing off the glass walls. "She is completely lying. Get her out of my home!" Patricia ignored me, turning her tear-streaked face directly toward the lead CPS agent. "My daughter has a long documented history of severe mental instability," she testified, her voice shaking with calculated grief. "Ever since her first marriage ended, she has been prone to violent, uncontrollable outbursts. We have tried to get her psychiatric help for years, but she refuses. She uses that poor boy as a prop, and behind closed doors, she is incredibly dangerous. Please, you have to take Leo. You have to protect him from her before she does something unthinkable." The social workers exchanged grim, validating glances, their suspicions completely cemented by the tearful testimony of a supposedly desperate, loving grandmother, willing to turn in her own daughter to save a child. The police officers immediately took a step forward, their hands dropping to their batons, fully prepared to physically rip my son from my arms. The police officers took another highly coordinated step forward, their hands resting menacingly on their utility belts. Alexander did not flinch. Instead, he widened his stance, turning his massive frame into an impenetrable barricade of solid muscle and bespoke wool between the authorities and my child. "If you lay a single finger on my wife or my son," Alexander stated, his voice dropping to a terrifying lethal calm that froze the air in the room, "you will trigger a legal bloodbath that will end your careers before the sun sets. I suggest you step outside, call your regional director, and thoroughly verify this anonymous tip before you make a catastrophic career-ending mistake." The lead CPS agent hesitated. The sheer weight of Alexander's unyielding authority combined with the extreme opulence of the penthouse finally gave her pause. She signaled for the officers to hold their positions and gestured for her partner to step out onto the private glass terrace to make a secure phone call. The absolute second the agents turned their backs and slid the glass doors shut, the entire atmosphere in the room violently shifted. Rachel slipped silently out of the private elevator, her eyes scanning the room before locking onto me. She moved swiftly across the marble foyer to join our mother. Patricia's theatrical, agonizing sobs stopped instantly. It was like watching a switch being flipped behind her eyes. Her face transformed from a portrait of maternal despair into a mask of pure, predatory calculation. She lunged forward, grabbing my arm with bruising force. Her manicured nails dug viciously into my flesh as she yanked me forcefully into the adjoining dimly lit hallway, dragging me entirely out of sight from the distracted authorities on the terrace. Rachel flanked me, instantly blocking my only exit back to Alexander. "Cut the pathetic hysterics, Madeline." Patricia hissed, her voice a harsh, venomous whisper that echoed off the silk-lined walls. She smoothed the front of her coat, her eyes glinting with a sickening, malicious triumph. "You have exactly 2 minutes before those agents walk back inside and rip that boy out of your arms. But there is a very simple, very elegant solution to all of this." I stared at the woman who had given birth to me, a cold wave of absolute revulsion crashing over me. I clutched Leo tighter against my chest, feeling his tiny heart racing against mine. "You orchestrated this entire nightmare," I breathed, my voice shaking with a primal fury. "You fabricated horrific child abuse allegations just to punish me." "We are simply reclaiming what is rightfully ours," Rachel snapped, crossing her arms defensively. "Your new husband completely humiliated us. He triggered the foreclosure on the family estate. He ruined Bradley and destroyed our financial safety net. Now we are officially negotiating a settlement. Alexander has billions in liquid assets, Madeline. $5 million is absolute pocket change to him." Patricia leaned in closer, the cloying scent of her expensive perfume turning my stomach. $5 million wired directly into a secure offshore account by the end of the business day. The absolute moment that transfer clears our bank, I will walk right back into that living room and tell the agents it was all a terrible emotional misunderstanding. I will claim I overreacted to a minor family disagreement and formally retract every single allegation of abuse. CPS will close the file immediately, the police will leave, and you get to keep playing happy family in your ivory tower. You are extorting me, I said, utterly staggered by the sheer unhinged evil of their plan. You are weaponizing the state child welfare system and using my innocent son as leverage to steal money from my husband. You are absolute monsters. We are survivors, Rachel sneered, stepping aggressively forward. She drove me backward until my spine hit the cold wall of the corridor. And you are completely out of options. Do not even think about trying to fight us in a custody court. Or have you magically forgotten about Dr. Aris? The name hit me like a physical blow to the chest. Dr. Aris was a highly unethical, exorbitantly priced private psychiatrist my parents had hired when I was 22. After I had suffered from a brief mild bout of depression following a severe car accident, Patricia had paid him under the table to aggressively misdiagnose me. They had fabricated a medical file claiming I suffered from severe borderline personality disorder and intermittent explosive disorder, using those fake documents to control my trust fund payouts and manipulate my early career choices. I had spent years fighting to have the fraudulent diagnosis expunged, eventually proving his malpractice, but the initial damning paperwork still existed in archaic sealed medical archives. I have the original signed affidavits from Dr. Aris. Rachel taunted, a wicked, triumphant smile twisting her features into something ugly. I have his clinical notes detailing your supposed violent tendencies, your emotional instability, and your complete inability to function as a rational adult. If you refuse to pay us the $5 million right now, we will let CPS take Leo today. And when we go to family court, Mom and I will testify under oath. We will submit those fabricated psychiatric evaluations directly to the judge. We will paint you as an unhinged, dangerous woman who poses an immediate lethal threat to her own child. You will lose custody forever, Madeline. You will never see your son again. The calculated, breathtaking viciousness of their extortion plot was staggering. They had weaponized my past trauma, manipulated a corrupt medical professional, and orchestrated a federal raid, all to extort Alexander's fortune. They were perfectly willing to permanently traumatize a young child and destroy a mother just to maintain their lavish, superficial lifestyle. You will go to federal prison for this, I whispered, my voice trembling with a mixture of sheer rage and terror. Patricia laughed, a cold, dry, sociopathic sound. No, darling, we will go to the Hamptons. You have 60 seconds to convince your billionaire husband to authorize the wire transfer. Make your choice. The silence in the hallway became incredibly suffocating, broken only by Leo's quiet, frightened whimpers against my collarbone. I looked into the empty, soulless eyes of my mother and sister, realizing with absolute certainty that there was no moral line they would not cross. Before I could open my mouth to respond, a crisp, melodic chime echoed through the penthouse. The private express elevator had arrived once more. Patricia and Rachel both whipped their heads around, their arrogant expressions faltering slightly at the unexpected interruption. The heavy steel doors glided open silently, and the atmosphere in the foyer instantly crystallized into ice. Dominic stepped out of the elevator. He was dressed in an impeccably tailored charcoal gray Tom Ford suit, looking like a lethal, highly polished weapon. His posture was rigid, commanding, and radiated absolute, untouchable legal authority. He held a sleek black leather attorney briefcase in his left hand. He did not even glance at Patricia or Rachel. He completely ignored their stunned, open-mouthed stares as he bypassed the hallway with the cold, calculated efficiency of an apex predator. He strode directly past them, his polished Oxford shoes clicking sharply against the marble floors, and walked straight into the main living room just as the CPS agents slid the glass doors open to return from the terrace. Dominic stopped dead center in the room, positioning himself directly in front of the lead social worker and the two police officers. He snapped his briefcase open with a sharp, echoing click that demanded total silence. He pulled out a thick stack of heavily notarized, gold-embossed legal documents and thrust them directly into the lead agent's hands. "I am Dominic Sterling," he announced, his voice slicing through the room with devastating, undeniable power. "I am a senior partner at Sterling & Vance, and I am here presenting my official credentials as the legally appointed court-mandated counsel for my nephew Leo Sterling." The lead CPS agent blinked, staring down at the heavy gold-embossed documents Dominic had just forcefully pressed into her hands. The two police officers instinctively took a step back, their hands dropping away from their utility belts as the sheer suffocating weight of Dominic's legal authority flooded the room. I remained anchored against the hallway wall, clutching Leo to my chest as Rachel and Patricia finally stumbled out from the dim corridor behind me. The malicious, triumphant smirks they had worn mere seconds ago were completely gone. They stared at Dominic in absolute paralyzed shock. Dominic was Rachel's husband. For years, he had remained quietly on the periphery of my family's toxic, sprawling drama, keeping his head down and his brilliant legal mind focused entirely on his highly publicized career as a ruthless federal prosecutor before recently joining Alexander's private firm. I had always assumed he was either oblivious to Rachel's genuine venomous nature or willfully ignorant of her sociopathic tendencies. I was entirely wrong. He had been watching them. He had been gathering evidence. Dominic did not even acknowledge his wife's horrified gasp. He smoothly pivoted on his heel, bypassing her completely, and placed his sleek leather briefcase flat on the center of our glass coffee table. With a sharp metallic click, he unlatched the hinges and retrieved a slim brushed aluminum laptop. He flipped the screen open, his fingers flying across the keyboard with practiced, terrifying precision. Agents, Dominic said, his voice carrying the flawless acoustic command of a veteran courtroom prosecutor. Before you take another step in this deeply compromised investigation, I require you to review a piece of highly relevant evidence regarding the exact origin of your anonymous tips. Rachel lunged forward, her voice rising in a frantic, reedy screech. Dominic, what are you doing? Shut that off right now, you are embarrassing me. Dominic completely ignored her. He hit a single key and a crisp, high-definition audio recording immediately flooded the silent penthouse. The sound quality was impeccable, captured by the advanced internal security dashcam system of Dominic's personal SUV, the exact vehicle Rachel had driven to pick up our mother earlier that afternoon. Patricia's shrill, calculating voice echoed clearly from the laptop speakers, completely destroying her carefully crafted facade of the weeping, concerned grandmother. Alexander has billions in liquid assets. $5 million is absolute pocket change to him. We call the child welfare hotline from a burner phone. We give them the exact floor plan of the penthouse. We tell them Madeline is having violent psychotic breaks and hitting the boy. Then Rachel's voice chimed in, perfectly preserved in digital amber, dripping with venomous, unchecked glee. It is brilliant, Mom. The second CPS shows up, Madeline will panic. I will back her into a corner in the hallway and offer to make the agents disappear if Alexander wires the $5 million to my offshore account. If she refuses, I will just give the agents Dr. Aris's old psychiatric files. She loses custody, and we get a massive settlement to drop the ensuing lawsuit. It is totally foolproof. The audio clip clicked off, leaving a ringing, catastrophic silence in its wake. Rachel and Patricia were completely paralyzed, anchored to the marble floor by the crushing, undeniable weight of their own recorded extortion plot. Patricia's mouth opened and closed silently, her chest heaving as she struggled to pull oxygen into her lungs. The fabricated tears she had weaponized for the social workers were gone, replaced entirely by the stark, hyperventilating terror of a trapped criminal realizing her life was over. Rachel looked physically ill, her hands shaking violently at her sides as she stared at the man she had married. The lead CPS agent's face flushed a deep, furious crimson. The profound realization that she and her department had been maliciously manipulated as pawns in a high-stakes financial crime radiated from her rigid posture. She snapped her manila folder shut with a vicious crack, glaring at Patricia with absolute, unfiltered disgust. Dominic slowly closed the laptop. He stood up to his full, intimidating height, turning his cold prosecutorial gaze directly onto his wife and mother-in-law. As a former state prosecutor and current senior partner at Sterling and Vance, I have a professional obligation to clearly outline the exact criminal statutes you have just willfully violated. Dominic stated his words, landing like heavy, devastating hammer blows against their fragile egos. You have intentionally filed a false report of severe child abuse to a federal agency, which is a Class E felony. You have conspired to commit perjury. You have engaged in severe premeditated emotional distress. And most importantly, you have just been caught on tape executing a $5 million extortion plot against my clients. Dominic, please, Rachel whimpered, stepping toward him with her hands outstretched, tears of genuine panic finally spilling down her pale cheeks. I am your wife. You cannot do this to your family. We were just desperate. Alexander took everything from us. We had no other choice. You stopped being my family the moment you decided to weaponize the state to kidnap an innocent child for a financial payout. Dominic replied, his voice absolutely devoid of warmth, hesitation, or mercy. I spent my entire career putting predators and extortionists in federal prison. Rachel, I will certainly not harbor one in my own home. My divorce attorneys will contact you tomorrow morning. Patricia frantically shook her head, backing toward the private elevator. This is a fabrication. That audio is fake. It is digitally generated. You are framing us. Dominic reached into the inner breast pocket of his tailored suit jacket. He pulled out a heavy polished silver badge housed in a black leather wallet, his official retained insignia from his highly decorated tenure at the district attorney's office. He tossed it onto the glass table. It landed with a sharp, heavy clatter that made both Patricia and Rachel jump in their skin. He turned his attention entirely to the two stunned CPS agents and the police officers who had already unclipped their radios and were glaring at my mother and sister with profound, deeply offended anger. Officers, Dominic commanded, pointing a steady, unwavering finger directly at Rachel and Patricia. You have heard the incontrovertible audio evidence. You have witnessed the ongoing extortion attempt. As an officer of the court, I am officially demanding that you detain these two women immediately. I want a full, comprehensive police report filed for felony extortion, criminal fraud, and filing a false police report against my own wife and my mother-in-law. Arrest them. The heavy steel doors of the private elevator sealed shut, taking the police officers and my restrained, humiliated family members down to the precinct. The absolute silence that descended upon the penthouse should have signaled the end of the war. Dominic's ruthless, calculated prosecution had effectively neutralized my mother and sister, resulting in an overnight detention and a frantic, wildly expensive bail hearing the very next day. I genuinely believed the immediate threat had been eradicated. I severely underestimated the depths of their depravity and the lengths they would go to extract Alexander's wealth. Barely 48 hours after the arrests, my phone shattered the early morning quiet. The caller ID flashed the number of the Platinum Wing at St. Jude's Medical Center, the city's most notoriously exclusive cash-only concierge hospital. A hushed, overly polite hospital administrator informed me that my father Richard had suffered a sudden severe cardiac event in the middle of the night. He had been rushed to their private VIP ward and was aggressively demanding to see his eldest daughter. The primal, deeply ingrained instinct of a child hearing their father was on his deathbed temporarily overrode the icy logic Alexander and Dominic had spent days instilling in me. Against Alexander's explicit advice, I ordered my driver to take me to St. Jude's. The Platinum Wing did not smell of antiseptic or sickness. It smelled of fresh lilies, espresso, and wealth. I bypassed the marble reception desk, my heart slamming against my ribs in a frantic rhythm, and pushed open the heavy mahogany double doors to Suite 402. I braced myself for the sight of monitors, ventilators, and the grim reality of a failing heart. Instead, I found Richard sitting completely upright in a plush motorized bed. He was not wearing a standard hospital gown, but a monogrammed silk robe. His color was perfectly healthy, and he was casually slicing into a catered plate of smoked salmon and poached eggs. There were no monitors beeping. There were no oxygen tubes. The terrifying rush of adrenaline in my veins instantly curdled into a heavy, sickening realization. Before I could even take a step backward, the suite's private bathroom door swung open. Patricia and Rachel emerged looking slightly haggard from their brief stint in holding, but otherwise vibrating with a venomous, predatory energy. I whipped my head toward the sitting area, near the floor-to-ceiling windows. Courtney was lounging on a leather sofa, scrolling through her phone. It was a trap. I spun on my heel, reaching for the brass handle of the heavy mahogany door to leave. I was completely done. I was not going to participate in another fabricated, unhinged family spectacle. Patricia and Rachel moved with terrifying, desperate speed. They lunged across the imported Persian rug, throwing their entire body weight against the door, just as my fingers brushed the handle. The heavy wood slammed shut with a resounding thud. Rachel planted her feet, crossing her arms, while Patricia pressed her back flat against the exit, physically barricading me inside the opulent hospital suite. "Get out of my way!" I demanded, my voice low and dangerous. "You are currently out on bail for attempting to extort my husband. Do not add false imprisonment to your list of federal charges. We are not leaving until you fulfill your basic obligations to this family." Patricia hissed, her eyes wild and manic. She reached into the pocket of her tailored slacks and produced a crumpled, heavily itemized stack of hospital invoices. She shoved the papers forcefully against my chest, forcing me to grab them or let them scatter to the floor. I glanced down at the bold print at the bottom of the page. The total was an astronomical $150,000. "Your father is suffering from extreme, life-threatening stress," Patricia shrieked, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling of the suite. "He required immediate concierge intervention. Our accounts are temporarily frozen because of your husband's malicious legal attacks. This wing does not accept our insurance. They are demanding immediate payment in full, or they will discharge him to a public county hospital. You are going to pay this bill right now." I stared at the woman blocking the door, utterly repulsed by the sheer audacity of her demand. "You orchestrated a fake heart attack to lure me into a hospital room so you could extort me again." I asked, the sheer absurdity of the situation rendering my tone completely flat. "It is your duty," Rachel snarled, stepping forward to invade my personal space. "You married into extreme, untouchable wealth. Alexander makes this kind of money in an hour. You owe us this, Madeline. You put us in this position by marrying that corporate shark and letting him ruin our reputation. You are going to clear this debt today." The door handle suddenly clicked from the outside. Patricia and Rachel stumbled forward as two concierge nurses in crisp, tailored scrubs pushed their way into the suite, carrying silver trays of fresh towels and sparkling water. The nurses froze instantly, sensing the volatile, highly aggressive atmosphere in the room. This was exactly the audience Courtney had been waiting for. She leaped off the leather sofa, her face contorting into a mask of exaggerated performative outrage. She stormed into the center of the room, raising her voice to a theatrical, echoing volume specifically designed to captivate the hospital staff. "I cannot believe you!" Madeline Courtney screamed, pointing a trembling, accusatory finger directly at my face. "Look at you. You are dripping in designer clothes and living in a billionaire's penthouse while your own father is lying in a hospital bed suffering from a heart condition you caused." The nurses exchanged wide-eyed, uncomfortable glances, clearly shocked by the vicious family drama unfolding in their exclusive ward. "You are a greedy, ungrateful daughter," Courtney continued, her voice echoing shrilly down the hallway outside the open door. "After everything this family has done for you, you would stand there, clutching your designer handbag, and let your father be thrown out onto the street over absolute pennies. You are a disgusting, selfish woman. You would actually let him die rather than part with a fraction of your husband's fortune." The silence that followed Courtney's vicious public shaming was heavy and expectant. Patricia, Rachel, and Courtney all stared at me, waiting for the inevitable emotional breakdown. They expected me to flush with humiliation, to stammer out a defense, or to crumble under the sheer weight of their public character assassination in front of the medical staff. They expected the Madeline they had manipulated and abused for 30 years to panic and submit to their financial demands just to make the screaming stop. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice, nor did I attempt to defend myself against the absolute absurdity of their claims. The emotional manipulation they had relied on for my entire life was completely dead to me. I looked at Richard, who was nervously gripping the edges of his silk robe. I looked at the $150,000 invoice still clutched in my hand. Then I maintained steady, dead-eyed eye contact with Courtney as I slowly reached into the interior pocket of my handbag. Without a single word, I pulled out Alexander's solid titanium invite-only American Express Centurion card. I turned my back on Courtney's flushed, contorted face and walked out of Suite 402. My heels clicked with absolute rhythmic precision against the polished hardwood floors of the platinum wing. I did not run. I did not hurry. I moved with the cold, deliberate pacing of a woman who completely controlled the board. I heard the frantic, scrambling footsteps of my mother and sister rushing to follow me. They flanked me as I approached the massive, curved mahogany reception desk at the end of the corridor, practically vibrating with a sickening mixture of adrenaline and greed. Patricia leaned in, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial, triumphant whisper. "You are finally using your brain, Madeline. This is exactly what family does. We take care of each other." I ignored her completely. I placed the heavily itemized, exorbitant invoice onto the marble counter. The billing concierge, a sharply dressed man who looked more like a wealth manager than a hospital administrator, glanced at the staggering sum. Then I slid the solid titanium Centurion card across the cold stone. The heavy metal made a distinct, muted scrape. The concierge's professional mask slipped for a fraction of a second. He recognized the weight, the color, and the absolute limitless financial power of the card. He processed the transaction in total silence. There was no declining beep. There was no call to the bank for authorization. $150,000 evaporated from Alexander's account with a single frictionless keystroke. The receipt printer whirred to life, spitting out a long strip of thermal paper. Rachel let out a breathy, exhilarated laugh. She looked at our mother, her eyes wide and glittering with the intoxicating rush of unearned wealth. They had done it. They genuinely believed their horrific staged ambush had successfully shattered my boundaries. They thought they had finally tapped into the sterling fortune, establishing a direct, permanent pipeline to my husband's billions. I could see the rapid calculations spinning behind Rachel's eyes, already planning her next manufactured crisis, her next extortion attempt. I took the receipt from the concierge, folded it neatly in half, and turned around. I walked back down the quiet, sunlit hallway, my family trailing behind me like victorious predators. We re-entered the VIP suite. Richard was still sitting comfortably in his motorized bed, having finished his catered breakfast. Courtney stood by the windows, crossing her arms with a smug, self-satisfied smirk. The air in the room was thick with their collective arrogance. I walked directly to the side of the hospital bed. I held out the receipt. Patricia snatched it from my fingers with aggressive, eager speed. She stared at the zero balance, a wide, genuine smile finally breaking across her carefully maintained features. "See," Patricia said, waving the slip of paper in the air. "Was that so difficult? You have effectively saved your father's life. You should feel incredibly proud of yourself." I did not smile back. I reached into the depths of my leather handbag for a second time. My fingers bypassed my wallet and closed around a thick, heavy envelope crafted from dense legal vellum. Dominic had meticulously prepared this specific package late last night in Alexander's private study, sealing it with the embossed crest of Sterling and Vance. I pulled the heavy document free and dropped it squarely onto Richard's empty breakfast tray. It landed with a dense, solid thud that instantly shattered the celebratory atmosphere. Patricia's triumphant smile faltered. Rachel stepped forward, her brow furrowing in confusion. "What is that?" Rachel demanded, her voice losing its arrogant edge. "More paperwork for the hospital." "No." I replied, my voice chillingly calm and entirely devoid of the fear they had relied upon for 3 decades. "That is your new reality." I looked down at Richard, whose color suddenly began to drain, revealing a genuine, terrifying panic that no fake heart attack could mimic. "Dominic is a remarkably thorough attorney," I stated, letting the words hang in the sterile air. "When he initiated his investigation into your financial standing to prepare for civil litigation, he did not just stop at securing your immediate detention. He conducted a comprehensive forensic audit of your entire financial portfolio. He found exactly how you managed to post bail so quickly. He found out how you have been keeping your lavish lifestyle afloat while your primary business faces total liquidation." Patricia took a shaky step backward, the hospital receipt fluttering from her hand to the floor. Courtney dropped her phone, the device clattering loudly against the hardwood. You took out a massive, highly leveraged second mortgage on the Springfield estate. I continued my gaze locking onto my father. You drained every single cent of equity left in your primary residence. You did it entirely in secret using a predatory private lending firm with astronomical interest rates just to pay off Rachel's mounting federal tax liens and keep her out of federal prison. You risked the very roof over your heads to fund this pathetic superficial illusion of wealth. Richard opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. He clutched the lapels of his silk robe, his hands trembling violently. But here is the truly unfortunate part of your financial strategy, I said, leaning closer to the bed so they could hear every single devastating syllable. Alexander's private equity firm specializes in the aggressive acquisition of distressed high-risk assets. When Dominic traced the paperwork to that specific private lender, Alexander made one phone call. Rachel gasped, stepping back until her shoulders hit the wall. The blood rushed from her face, leaving her looking hollow and terrified. Alexander bought the debt. I whispered the finality of the statement, ringing like a death knell in the quiet suite. He acquired the exact note on your second mortgage at a premium. As of 8 o'clock this morning, the paperwork was finalized and fully registered with the state. I pointed to the heavy vellum envelope sitting on the tray. That is the official notification of the transfer of ownership. I straightened my posture, looking at the 4 people who had tormented me for a lifetime. I paid your hospital bill today because I do not want you to die, Father. But make no mistake. My husband now owns your debt. My husband holds the note to your home. We own the estate. If you ever attempt to contact me, approach my son, or manufacture another crisis to extort my family again, Alexander will foreclose on the property and have you all legally evicted by the county sheriff before dinner. You are entirely permanently at our mercy. I watched the color completely drain from my father's face, replacing the healthy, robust flush of a man enjoying poached eggs with the genuine sickly pallor of absolute ruin. The silence in the VIP suite was sudden and absolute, thick enough to choke on. The 2 concierge nurses, having witnessed enough high-net-worth implosions to know exactly when a dynasty was collapsing, had silently slipped backward out of the heavy mahogany doors, leaving us entirely alone. I leaned forward, bracing my hands on the pristine white sheets of his motorized bed. I closed the distance between us until I could see the dilated pupils of his eyes, the rapid, terrified pulse beating frantically at the base of his throat. He shrank back against the plush pillows, pulling the monogrammed silk robe tighter around his chest, as if the thin silk could somehow protect him from the financial execution I was currently administering. You thought you were so incredibly clever, I murmured, my voice a soft velvet whisper that cut through the sterile quiet of the room. You orchestrated this entire theatrical production. The fake cardiac event, the private suite, the audience of nurses, all designed to corner me into paying your exorbitant bills. You thought you were tapping into my husband's wealth, breaking my boundaries, and re-establishing your dominance over me. Patricia opened her mouth to interject, her hands trembling violently, but I silenced her with a single razor-sharp glare before turning my attention back to the man who had permitted my lifelong torment. But you fundamentally misunderstood who you were dealing with, Richard. Alexander does not just buy toxic debt. He weaponizes it. I smiled, a cold, empty expression that made my father swallow hard. Did you honestly believe a private equity firm of that magnitude would purchase a high-risk underwater second mortgage without embedding a hyper-aggressive acceleration clause? Rachel let out a sharp, panicked breath, taking another step backward until she bumped into the leather sofa. When you forced me to pay that $150,000 medical invoice to prevent your transfer to a public county ward, you legally established a documented catastrophic inability to service your own immediate debts. I explained, enunciating every syllable with lethal precision. By officially shifting your massive liabilities onto a third party, you provided irrefutable proof of gross financial insolvency. You triggered the exact conditions required to activate the default covenant hidden deep within your new mortgage agreement. The words hung suspended in the air, heavy and inescapable. Paying that bill did not save you, I concluded softly, straightening my spine and looking down at him with absolute detachment. It legally finalized your ruin. The loan is immediately accelerated. The entire balance is due right now. And because you cannot pay it, the estate is officially in default. For a fraction of a second, the room remained frozen in a state of suspended animation. Then the VIP suite violently erupted. Richard's supposed life-threatening illness instantly evaporated. The fragile, dying patriarch act vanished in a sudden, explosive surge of furious adrenaline. He miraculously recovered from his manufactured heart attack, kicking the plush blankets off his legs and leaping out of the hospital bed with the agility of a man 30 years younger. His face contorted into an ugly, mottled mask of pure rage. "You treacherous, vindictive bitch!" Richard roared, his voice booming with terrifying, unchecked volume, sending the empty breakfast tray clattering onto the Persian rug. He lunged forward, his fists clenched, spit flying from his lips. "I am your father. I gave you everything. You arrogant, ungrateful little mistake. I will destroy you for this." Patricia shrieked a high-pitched, chaotic wail, grabbing his arm to hold him back, while simultaneously screaming at me. "How could you do this to your own family? You are a monster, Madeline. You are completely sick in the head." Behind them, a different kind of panic was rapidly unfolding. Rachel had ripped her cell phone from her designer handbag, her fingers trembling so violently she could barely tap the glass screen. She was frantically trying to log into her offshore banking applications, desperate to verify that her hidden reserves were still intact. "It is not working," Rachel gasped, her voice cracking as she tapped the screen over and over again. "The app is locking me out. It says contact the administrator." She raised the phone to her ear, dialing her private wealth manager with frantic urgency. The line rang twice before she was met with a cold, automated message. She yanked the phone away, her eyes wide with a manic, suffocating terror. "My accounts are frozen!" Rachel screamed, her voice bordering on hysterical. She looked at Patricia, hyperventilating. "Mom, the routing numbers are invalid. The bank just flagged everything. They locked down all the trust payouts and the offshore reserves. We have absolutely nothing left. The balances say zero." Dominic's ruthless federal injunctions had clearly hit their targets exactly on schedule. He had severed their financial lifelines, freezing every hidden asset and liquid account tied to their names pending the extortion and fraud investigations. They were entirely boxed in, stripped of the generational wealth that had defined their entire existence. Courtney, who had been loudly shaming me just minutes prior, collapsed back onto the leather sofa. She curled her knees to her chest, bursting into loud, genuine, ugly tears. The reality that her endless free ride, her designer allowances, and her untouchable social status were permanently gone had finally registered in her mind. I stood completely still in the center of the chaotic, screaming hospital suite, watching the people who had abused me for 3 decades completely self-destruct. I felt no pity. I felt no guilt. I only felt a profound, echoing emptiness being filled with absolute, unshakable peace. The terrified little girl who had spent her life begging for their approval was completely gone, replaced by a woman forged in the fires they had set. Richard took another aggressive step toward me, his chest heaving, his face inches from mine. "You think you have won?" He spat, his voice dropping to a menacing growl. "We will fight this in court. We will drag your name and Alexander's reputation through the mud. We will tie you up in litigation for the next decade. That house belongs to me. It has been in my name for 40 years, and you are not taking it." I did not blink. I did not step back. I maintained steady, dead-eyed contact with him as I reached into the interior pocket of my handbag one final time. I bypassed the titanium credit card and pulled out a single stark white piece of paper. It was folded, neatly stamped with the official seal of the county clerk's office, and devoid of any ornate gold-embossed firm logos. It was pure lethal legal reality. I dropped the formal eviction notice right onto the center of Richard's unmade hospital bed. "I am now the sole owner of that house. You have until midnight to pack your bags." I did not wait to watch Richard process the physical reality of his eviction. I simply turned and walked out of the Platinum Wing, leaving the sterile hospital corridor and my toxic family behind, forever. Alexander's private jet carried us back to New York that very afternoon. I assumed the absolute undeniable seizure of their ancestral home and the freezing of their remaining assets would be the definitive end of their extortion campaign. I believed absolute ruin would force them into quiet obscurity. I severely underestimated the feral, chaotic nature of true desperation. 2 weeks later, the crisp autumn air of Manhattan swept through the city as Alexander and I prepared for the pinnacle event of the social season. The Crystal Winter Charity Gala was the most exclusive, impenetrable high society gathering in New York. Hosted in the grand vaulted ballroom of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the guest list was a strictly curated assembly of billionaires, international tech magnates, foreign dignitaries, and political titans. Alexander's firm was the primary benefactor of the evening, making us the undisputed guests of honor. As we descended the grand staircase into the ballroom surrounded by towering floral arrangements of white orchids, cascading crystal chandeliers, and the soft acoustic melodies of a live string quartet, I felt an overwhelming sense of peace. I wore a custom emerald green silk gown, Alexander's hand resting firmly on the small of my back. For the first time in my life, I felt completely secure. That safety was an illusion. My family had not retreated to lick their wounds. Driven to the absolute brink of madness by their sudden poverty and my refusal to submit, Rachel and Courtney had liquidated whatever untraceable luxury goods they had managed to smuggle out of the Springfield estate before the sheriff locked the doors. They used that desperate final stack of cash to purchase counterfeit black market tickets from a compromised event promoter. They bypassed the strict biometric security checkpoints at the main entrance by aggressively mingling with a large, chaotic group of minor internet influencers. They slinked into the grand ballroom like parasites, hiding in the shadows of the massive marble pillars, waiting for the perfect moment to execute their final suicidal act of public vengeance. The gala had reached its peak. The string quartet faded into silence as the event coordinator took the main stage, tapping the microphone to introduce Alexander and me for our keynote address regarding the charity's upcoming pediatric wing. Before the coordinator could even utter my husband's name, a violent commotion erupted near the side aisles. A frantic, stumbling figure forcefully shoved past two tuxedo-clad waiters, sending a heavy silver tray of champagne flutes crashing to the polished marble floor. It was Courtney. She looked absolutely unhinged. Her designer dress was deeply wrinkled and stained her hair a tangled, chaotic mess that framed her flushed face. The heavy, sour scent of cheap alcohol radiated from her as she sprinted up the stairs to the stage. Before the stunned coordinator could signal for help, Courtney forcefully ripped the microphone from his hands. A sharp, ear-piercing screech of audio feedback echoed through the cavernous ballroom, instantly silencing the hundreds of elite guests. "Do not clap for her!" Courtney screamed into the microphone, her voice slurred, frantic, and dripping with venom. She pointed a shaking, manicured finger directly at my table in the center of the room. "You all think Madeline Sterling is some generous, elegant philanthropist. You think she is a wonderful, loving mother. She is a total fraud. She is a cold, calculating monster." The entire room froze in collective shock. Alexander's jaw tightened into a rigid line of pure, lethal fury. He immediately raised two fingers, silently signaling his private security details stationed at the perimeter of the room to move in. But Courtney was speaking too fast, her drunken rage spilling over into a hysterical, echoing broadcast that bounced off the museum walls. "She did not adopt that child because she wanted to be a mother," Courtney shrieked, tears of manic desperation streaming down her cheeks. "She bought him. She literally purchased an orphan to use as a prop. She knew Alexander Sterling wanted an heir, so she manipulated the system, bought a little boy named Leo, and trapped a billionaire into marriage. And then she stole her own family's home to fund this pathetic high society charade. She left her dying father out on the street so she could wear emerald silk and drink expensive champagne while pretending to be a saint." A wave of horrified gasps rippled through the crowd of billionaires and dignitaries. People whispered behind their hands, staring at me with a mixture of shock, outrage, and morbid fascination. Courtney's words were entirely fabricated, a deranged twisting of reality designed to inflict maximum reputational damage. But in a room built entirely on public perception and flawless reputations, the accusation alone was a live grenade. I remained seated, my posture perfectly straight, refusing to give Courtney the satisfaction of a visible reaction or a single tear. Alexander stood up, his towering frame blocking me from the stage, ready to personally escort the lunacy out of the building. But Courtney was merely the loud, chaotic distraction. As Alexander's security guards rushed the stage to tackle my sister and rip the microphone from her hands, a sudden, violent blur of movement erupted from the opposite side of the ballroom. Patricia had not secured a black market ticket. She had bypassed the guest list entirely by slipping through the service corridors and the rear catering entrance. She marched past the frantic kitchen staff with the sheer arrogant entitlement of a woman who genuinely believed she owned the world, ignoring their shouts to stop. My mother stormed onto the main floor, her eyes wide and feral with an unchecked, consuming hatred. I turned my head just as she closed the final few feet between us. Alexander reached out to intercept her, but she was moving with the unnatural, terrifying speed of a trapped animal with absolutely nothing left to lose. Before anyone could stop her, Patricia raised her arm high into the air and brought her open hand across my face with every single ounce of her physical strength. The violent, resounding crack of the slap echoed through the dead silence of the ballroom, a brutal physical strike delivered in front of hundreds of the most powerful people on earth. The kinetic force of the strike snapped my head violently to the side. A sharp, searing heat immediately bloomed across my left cheek, followed by the metallic taste of blood where my teeth had caught the inside of my lip. The physical impact was jarring, but the absolute suffocating silence that instantly descended upon the grand ballroom was far more deafening. 400 of New York's most powerful, untouchable elite froze in synchronized horror. Champagne flutes paused halfway to lips. Waiters stood completely paralyzed, like marble statues. Alexander moved with a terrifying, predatory speed. His eyes went completely black, his towering frame stepping forward to physically dismantle the woman who had just assaulted his wife. He reached for Patricia, his hands curling into white-knuckled fists, ready to unleash a wrath that would have put her in the intensive care unit. Alexander, halt. The command was not shouted, it was not screamed. It was spoken with a soft glacial authority that carried the unmistakable crushing weight of absolute power. It sliced through the tense air of the ballroom, stopping my husband dead in his tracks. Every single head in the cavernous museum turned toward the grand sweeping staircase. Descending the marble steps with the slow, terrifying elegance of a reigning monarch was Beatrice Sterling. She was Alexander's mother, the fiercely private, fiercely protective matriarch of a financial dynasty that predated the Industrial Revolution. She wore a high-necked gown of midnight blue velvet, her silver hair pulled back into a flawless chignon. She did not walk. She glided, parting the sea of billionaires, politicians, and foreign dignitaries as if they were mere peasants. They stepped back instinctively, lowering their eyes in deep, ingrained deference. Patricia stood anchored to the floor, her chest heaving, the palm of her hand rapidly turning bright red. The adrenaline of her violent outburst was evaporating, rapidly replaced by the dawning, sickening realization of exactly where she was and exactly who was approaching her. Beatrice did not even look at Patricia. She bypassed my mother completely, stepping directly in front of me. She reached out with a cool, manicured hand and gently tilted my chin, inspecting the angry red welt blossoming across my skin. Her eyes, the same piercing icy blue as Alexander's, softened for a fraction of a second when she looked at me before hardening into solid diamond as she slowly turned to face the intruders. "You dare bring your filth into my house!" Beatrice whispered, her voice projecting effortlessly across the silent room. "You dare lay a hand on the woman who saved my family!" Patricia opened her mouth, her voice trembling as she attempted to salvage her manufactured narrative. "She is a liar," Patricia stammered, pointing a shaking finger at me. "She stole our money. She bought that child to trap your son." Beatrice did not argue. She did not raise her voice to match Patricia's frantic pitch. She simply raised her right hand into the air and snapped her fingers once. The response was instantaneous. The event technician stationed in the elevated audiovisual booth executed her silent command with terrified precision. The massive high-definition projection screens flanking the main stage abruptly cut away from the sparkling gold leaf charity logos. The ballroom plunged into darkness for a split second before the screens flared back to life, illuminating the entire museum with crystal-clear, undeniably authentic hidden security footage. The video displayed a lavish, brightly lit nursery. The timestamp in the corner indicated the recording was exactly 2 years old. Courtney, who was still pinned to the floor by Alexander's security team, suddenly stopped struggling. She went completely, horrifyingly still. The color drained from her face, leaving her looking like a reanimated corpse. She knew exactly what room that was. She knew exactly what footage they were playing. The audio fed directly into the ballroom's state-of-the-art surround sound system, echoing off the vaulted ceilings. A tiny, fragile toddler was sitting on a plush rug crying softly, clutching a stuffed bear. It was Leo. Then Courtney marched into the frame. She was not wearing a gala dress, she was wearing generic practical scrubs. "Shut up!" the digital version of Courtney screamed on the massive screens, her voice vicious and laced with unchecked malice. "Shut your mouth right now, you little brat! I am sick of hearing you whine!" The crowd of philanthropists and titans of industry gasped in collective revulsion. On the screen, Courtney grabbed the stuffed bear and violently yanked it out of the crying child's hands, throwing it across the room. She leaned over the terrified toddler, her face twisted in rage. "Your mother is dead, and nobody wants to hear you cry about it. You are a burden. You are nothing but a pathetic burden." The video cut to black. The screens went dark. The silence in the ballroom was no longer born of shock. It was forged in pure, unfiltered disgust. Hundreds of eyes turned from the dark screens to glare directly at the two women standing in the center of the room. Patricia looked physically ill, her jaw slack, her eyes darting frantically for an exit that did not exist. Courtney was hyperventilating on the floor, weeping in genuine, absolute terror as the devastating reality of her exposure set in. Beatrice calmly walked over to the security guard who had confiscated the microphone from Courtney. She took the silver device, holding it loosely in her elegant grip. She turned to face the hundreds of elite guests, her posture radiating absolute command. "That woman writhing on the floor is not Madeline's sister acting out of familial concern," Beatrice announced, her voice echoing with devastating clarity. "That woman was a hired temporary caregiver." Beatrice paused, letting her gaze sweep across the captivated audience. "3 years ago, my beautiful daughter Genevieve died tragically in an aviation accident." Beatrice continued, her voice tightening with a profound, lingering grief that commanded total respect from the crowd. "She left behind my precious grandson Leo. Alexander and I were entirely consumed by our mourning. In our darkest hour of grief, we trusted a domestic staffing agency to provide a temporary nanny to help care for the boy while we arranged his permanent guardianship. We unknowingly hired a monster." Beatrice turned her icy, piercing gaze directly onto Patricia, who was practically shrinking into the floorboards under the crushing weight of the matriarch's wrath. "Courtney verbally and emotionally terrorized my grieving grandson in secret," Beatrice stated, her voice hardening into steel. She would have continued to abuse him had it not been for the extraordinary courage of a young preschool teacher who noticed the signs of trauma, installed a hidden camera to capture the undeniable proof, and personally brought the footage directly to my son. The entire ballroom turned to look at me. The judgment and suspicion that had clouded their faces just moments ago vanished entirely, replaced by profound respect and absolute awe. "Madeline did not buy a child," Beatrice declared, her voice ringing with finality. "Madeline stepped into the line of fire to save my grandson from a sociopath. She risked her own safety to protect a child she did not even know. She is the moral compass of the Sterling family, and she is the only mother Leo will ever need." Beatrice lowered the microphone and stared directly at my mother and sister, her eyes burning with the promised vengeance of an untouched dynasty. "You came into my house to humiliate the woman who saved my bloodline," Beatrice whispered, her voice devoid of any mercy. You will not leave this room with a shred of dignity, a single cent to your names, or a single place to hide. Security, call the police. I want these intruders arrested for assault, trespassing, and criminal harassment immediately." The heavy brass doors at the rear of the grand ballroom swung open with a resounding crash. A tactical unit of NYPD officers, having already been stationed outside the museum for high-profile event security, poured into the space. They moved with the swift, uncompromising efficiency required when the city's most influential billionaires were threatened. The officers parted the crowd of stunned dignitaries, their heavy boots thudding against the polished marble floor, and immediately swarmed the stage. Courtney scrambled backward, her tear-streaked face twisting in absolute panic as two officers grabbed her arms. She kicked and thrashed her designer heels, slipping on the slick stones, screaming that she had a right to be there, that it was a misunderstanding. Alexander's head of security stepped forward smoothly, handing a thick, legally certified folder directly to the lead officer. He did not raise his voice, but the flawless acoustics of the cavernous room carried his words to the front rows. "That is a federal restraining order," the security chief stated with mechanical precision. "It was issued 3 years ago permanently, barring Courtney from coming within 500 feet of my client's son, Leo Sterling. By forcing her way into an event hosted by his legal guardians and publicly addressing the child, she is in direct, severe violation of a standing court mandate." The lead officer nodded, snapping a pair of heavy steel handcuffs around Courtney's wrists. The metallic click echoed sharply. Courtney's frantic protests devolved into high-pitched guttural screams as the officers forcefully hauled her to her feet. She thrashed wildly, her expensive gown tearing at the seam, but the officers remained entirely unbothered, dragging her bodily down the center aisle. Hundreds of the wealthiest people in the world watched in disgusted silence as she was hauled out of the museum, her unhinged shrieks fading into the cold Manhattan night. The immediate physical threat was neutralized, but the true execution was just beginning. Beatrice Sterling slowly turned her attention away from the exit and locked her piercing, icy gaze onto Patricia and Rachel. My mother and sister were huddled together near the edge of the stage, shivering, stripped of their arrogance, and completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of their miscalculation. Beatrice raised the microphone back to her lips. She did not look at the crowd. She kept her eyes fixed entirely on the two women cowering before her, but her words were designed for every single person in that ballroom. To the board members, bank executives, and real estate developers in this room, Beatrice announced, her voice resonating with a terrifying, absolute calm. "Look very closely at the women standing before you, Patricia and Rachel. They are individuals who believe that cruelty is a currency and that manipulation is a valid social strategy. They have terrorized a child. They have assaulted my daughter-in-law. They have attempted to extort the Sterling family." Patricia visibly flinched, holding her hands up in a pathetic, trembling gesture of surrender. But Beatrice continued, her words landing like heavy, devastating hammer blows. "I am officially issuing a mandate," Beatrice declared, her voice dropping to a glacial, uncompromising pitch. "From this exact second forward, these women are permanently blacklisted from every financial, social, and real estate institution on the East Coast. Any bank that issues them a loan, any firm that manages their portfolio, any broker who shows them a property, and any social club that grants them entry will immediately and permanently lose the business of the Sterling enterprise and all of our subsidiaries." A collective silent nod rippled through the crowd. CEOs of multinational banks, heads of elite real estate brokerages, and the gatekeepers of New York high society silently registered the command. It was an excommunication. It was the absolute, total erasure of my mother and sister from the world they had spent their entire lives desperately trying to conquer. Beatrice had not just ruined them socially, she had weaponized the entire infrastructure of the city against them. They were effectively quarantined, branded as financial and social untouchables. Patricia's legs finally gave out. She dropped to her knees on the marble floor, her face buried in her hands, weeping in loud, jagged gasps. The facade of the elegant, superior matriarch had entirely dissolved, leaving only a broken, destitute woman facing the cold reality of her absolute ruin. Rachel stood frozen beside her mother, her breathing shallow and erratic. She opened her mouth to plead, to offer some desperate final negotiation, but the words died in her throat. Suddenly, the quiet of the ballroom was pierced by a rapid, continuous buzzing. The sound was coming from Rachel's designer clutch. It vibrated violently, a relentless mechanical hum that demanded immediate attention. Rachel reached into her bag with a trembling manicured hand and pulled out her smartphone. The screen was lit up, flashing with a cascading waterfall of urgent, red-bannered push notifications. Rachel stared at the glowing screen, her eyes widening in a state of pure, unadulterated horror. The notifications poured in with mechanical, merciless speed. Her primary corporate banking application flashed an alert indicating that her business accounts had been entirely frozen, pending immediate internal review. A split second later, an email notification dropped down from her private wealth manager, stating that her personal lines of credit had been terminated with immediate effect. Then came the alerts from American Express and Chase informing her that every single one of her Platinum and Reserve credit cards had been suspended due to severe compliance violations. The digital alerts stacked up one after another, an overwhelming avalanche of financial termination. Beatrice's words had not just been a threat, they were an immediate executed reality. The executives in the room had not even needed to make a phone call. Their respective risk management teams had already anticipated the shift in power and acted defensively to purge their institutions of toxic liabilities. Rachel dropped the phone. It shattered against the hard marble, the cracked screen still glowing with the final notification of her complete bankruptcy. She fell to her knees beside Patricia, staring blankly at the floor. The realization crashed over them, crushing whatever lingering, desperate hope they had harbored. There would be no clever scheme to escape this. There would be no manipulation, no extortion, no grand return to their suburban estate. They had brought a petty, vindictive family dispute to a war governed by the titans of industry, and they had been entirely, irreversibly eradicated. The family was utterly, permanently ruined. The immediate aftermath of the gala left Patricia and Rachel with nothing but the torn designer clothes on their backs. Ejected onto the cold, unforgiving pavement of Fifth Avenue, stripped of their credit cards, their social standing, and their ancestral home, they faced the terrifying, suffocating void of absolute poverty. For a normal person, this level of total systemic ruin would force a profound reckoning. But my mother and sister were not normal people. Desperation did not bring them clarity. It bred a very specific, highly dangerous breed of delusion. Driven to the absolute brink of madness by their impending homelessness and bankruptcy, they refused to surrender. If they could no longer intimidate me into opening my checkbook, they decided they would simply use the legal system to enslave me. They doubled down on their own manufactured reality. They convinced themselves that I had not outsmarted them, but that I had genuinely lost my mind. They scraped together the absolute last of their hidden cash reserves, perhaps pawning a final piece of smuggled jewelry to hire a bottom-feeding attorney known for aggressive scorched earth litigation. Together, they filed an emergency ex parte petition in the New York Supreme Court for a full permanent conservatorship over my person and my entire financial estate. Their strategy was as audacious as it was deranged. They planned to claim that my recent actions were not the calculated maneuvers of an independent woman, but the erratic, highly dangerous symptoms of a severe psychotic break. They intended to argue that my marriage to a billionaire, the legal seizure of their Springfield estate, and the adoption of Leo were the reckless, impulsive decisions of a woman completely detached from reality. They wanted the court to declare me legally incompetent so Patricia could be appointed as my permanent guardian, giving her immediate, unrestricted access to the sterling fortune. 2 days later, we were summoned to a heavily secured wood-paneled courtroom in downtown Manhattan. The air was thick with the scent of floor wax and old paper. Patricia and Rachel sat at the petitioner's table looking ragged but fueled by a toxic, manic adrenaline. They had managed to dress in dark, conservative suits, desperately trying to project the image of a concerned, loving family forced to take drastic measures to save a sick relative. Sitting directly beside them was Dr. Eris Thorne. He was a notoriously unethical, heavily bribed psychiatrist who specialized in rapid, high net worth incompetency diagnoses. He was the kind of doctor who would declare a perfectly sane person unfit to manage their own affairs for the right price, serving as the medical muscle for greedy heirs looking to lock away wealthy relatives. He sat with his hands neatly folded over a thick, entirely fabricated medical file bearing my name. The proceedings began with their attorney launching into a theatrical, impassioned monologue. He painted a tragic, wildly distorted portrait of my life. He stood before the judge and claimed that I had suffered a catastrophic mental collapse. He argued that the pressure of my career had fractured my sanity, causing me to develop severe delusions of grandeur and extreme paranoia regarding my own family. He cited my hyper-aggressive real estate transactions as undeniable proof of financial recklessness. He dramatically pointed to the sudden, secret nature of my marriage to Alexander as evidence of a manic episode. Patricia played her part flawlessly. She sat at the table dabbing her dry eyes with a tissue, nodding along with the lawyer's tragic narrative. She occasionally let out a soft, manufactured sob, playing the role of the devastated mother, watching her eldest daughter spiral into madness. Rachel sat perfectly still, her eyes locked onto the back of the judge's head, her greed so palpable it practically vibrated in the quiet courtroom. Dr. Thorne was called to the stand to deliver the killing blow. He adjusted his glasses and spoke with a smooth, practiced clinical detachment. He confidently testified that based on his comprehensive review of my recent behavioral patterns and financial decisions, I was suffering from a rapid onset cluster B personality disorder accompanied by severe psychotic features. He utilized heavy, complex psychological jargon to mask the absolute lack of any actual medical examination. He stated under oath that I lacked the fundamental capacity to understand the consequences of my actions. He concluded his testimony by declaring me a profound danger to myself, demanding that immediate control of my assets be transferred to my biological mother to prevent the total dissipation of my wealth. The courtroom was entirely silent as Dr. Thorne stepped down from the witness stand. The narrative they had constructed was terrifyingly thorough. On paper to a stranger, the sudden marriage, the sudden adoption, and the ruthless foreclosure of my family's home could easily be framed as the actions of an unstable mind. They had built a perfect legally binding cage, and they were waiting for the judge to lock the door. I sat at the defense table wearing a sharply tailored charcoal suit. I did not fidget. I did not object to the blatant lies being spoken under oath. I did not show a single ounce of fear or outrage. I sat perfectly still, my hands resting calmly on the polished oak table, a slight knowing smile playing on my lips. Alexander sat right beside me, his presence a silent, towering wall of absolute power, his eyes fixed on the judge with lethal intensity. The judge, a stern, deeply serious man, with no patience for frivolity, slowly adjusted his reading glasses. He looked down at the massive stack of fabricated psychological evaluations and emergency injunction requests presented by my mother's attorney. He flipped through the pages in silence, the rustling of paper, the only sound in the room. Finally, he looked up, his gaze shifting from the petitioner's table to me. He asked if the defense had any initial statement or evidence to present before he ruled on the emergency temporary conservatorship. I maintained steady eye contact with the judge. I simply shook my head and stated that I did not need to speak in my own defense. At that exact moment, the heavy brass handles of the massive oak doors at the back of the courtroom slowly turned, and the doors swung wide open. The heavy brass handles struck the wooden wall with a reverberating crack that shattered the breathless silence of the courtroom. The sudden disruption sent a shockwave through the gallery. The judge immediately raised his wooden gavel, his face flushing with severe irritation at the blatant breach of judicial decorum. He opened his mouth to order the bailiffs to clear the doorway and secure the rear of the chamber. Patricia, however, possessed the feral survivalist instincts of a cornered predator. She recognized instantly that the momentum of her carefully orchestrated legal ambush was slipping. Before the judge could strike his gavel and halt the proceedings, she abandoned her seat at the petitioner's table. She threw herself toward the center podium, launching into a tear-jerking, Oscar-worthy performance of maternal devastation designed to blindside the court before anyone could investigate the interruption. She collapsed against the wooden stand, her shoulders heaving with violent manufactured sobs. She wept openly, burying her face in her hands, before looking up at the bench with wide, pleading eyes. She painted a horrifying, vivid portrait of me as a woman who had completely lost her grip on reality. She claimed I was a profound danger, not only to myself, but to society at large. Her voice trembled perfectly as she recounted fabricated stories of my supposed manic episodes, alleging that I was wandering the city in a state of delusion, executing massive erratic wire transfers, and burning through millions of dollars in reckless psychotic fugues. She begged the judge, her hands clasped together in desperate prayer, to grant her total, immediate control of my finances. She insisted that legally stripping me of my autonomy and placing my entire estate under her permanent conservatorship was the only way to save me from total self-destruction. Sensing the emotional weight of her performance hanging over the room, her sleazy attorney immediately seized the opening to bypass standard procedure. He quickly called Dr. Thorne back to the witness stand for a highly irregular redirect examination. The bribed psychiatrist adjusted his tie, clearing his throat, to deliver the final fatal diagnosis. He opened a thick leather binder, presenting an entirely new stack of falsified medical evaluations to the court. Dr. Thorne spoke with clinical, terrifying authority. He utilized a rapid-fire barrage of complex neuropsychiatric terminology specifically engineered to overwhelm the judge with scientific authority. He pointed to fabricated psychological profiles and forged behavioral assessments, testifying under oath that my cognitive decline was irreversible. He labeled my sudden marriage to Alexander, my adoption of Leo, and the foreclosure of the Springfield estate as undeniable textbook symptoms of a paranoid, destructive psychological break. He officially permanently labeled me legally incompetent on the public record. He urged the judge to immediately sign the asset transfer documents, claiming that any delay would result in the catastrophic dissipation of the sterling wealth. At the petitioner's table, the arrogant facade of my family returned in full force. Rachel leaned back in her heavy leather chair, a venomous, triumphant smirk spreading across her face. She practically vibrated with anticipation, her eyes darting between the judge's pen and the conservatorship decree resting on the bench. Patricia dabbed at her dry eyes with a silk handkerchief, looking down her nose at me from the witness stand. They looked incredibly smug. They genuinely believed their theatrical execution had worked. They thought they had successfully weaponized the New York Supreme Court, cornering me in a legal trap with absolutely no possible exit. They were already mentally spending the fortune they believed they had just stolen. The judge reached for his pen, hovering the ink over the temporary conservatorship order. That was when the figure standing in the open doorway finally moved. Dominic stepped out of the shadows of the antechamber and into the bright fluorescent light of the courtroom. He did not apologize for the interruption. He did not wait to be recognized by the court or the bailiffs. He simply strutted down the center aisle with the terrifying predatory swagger of a corporate assassin who had already won the war. He was not empty-handed. Dominic was pushing a massive, heavy-duty industrial metal cart. The thick rubber wheels clattered aggressively against the polished hardwood floor, a loud rhythmic thudding that completely drowned out the end of Dr. Thorne's perjured testimony. The cart groaned under its own sheer physical weight. It was piled impossibly high with dozens of identical, tightly sealed banker's boxes. Each cardboard box was stamped with bright red, highly classified evidentiary seals from a private corporate intelligence firm. He leaned his weight into the metal handle, marching straight past Patricia. He entirely ignored her sudden sharp gasp of panic as she gripped the edges of the podium. He rolled right past Rachel, who instinctively shrank back into her leather chair as the towering stack of boxes cast a dark shadow over the petitioner's table. The smugness instantly vanished from their faces, replaced by a creeping, suffocating dread. Dominic slammed the heavy metal cart to a violent halt directly in front of the judge's elevated bench. The impact echoed like a thunderclap vibrating through the floorboards. He looked up at the judge, straightened his bespoke Italian tie, and offered a sharp, dangerous smile, completely interrupting the final moments of the doctor's fabricated testimony. Dominic rested his hands firmly on the lid of the top box, the crisp, unyielding silence of the room amplifying the immense weight of his presence. He looked directly at the presiding judge, completely ignoring the sputtering outrage of Patricia's high-priced attorney and the sudden panicked gasps emanating from the petitioner's table. "Your Honor." Dominic began, his voice a rich, booming baritone that commanded absolute authority across the cavernous room. "My name is Dominic Vance. I am an officer of this court, a licensed attorney in the state of New York, and as of exactly 30 minutes ago, I am the soon-to-be ex-husband of the petitioner, sitting before you, Rachel." Rachel let out a sharp, guttural choke. She half stood from her heavy leather chair, her perfectly manicured hands trembling violently as she reached out toward him. Her eyes were wide with a sudden, suffocating terror. Dominic did not even grant her the dignity of a glance. His posture was rigid, his gaze locked intensely on the bench. "I am officially interrupting these proceedings to submit a comprehensive, fully verified dossier of state's evidence," Dominic declared, his words landing like heavy stones. "What you have been listening to for the past hour is not an impartial medical evaluation. It is a highly coordinated, heavily funded criminal conspiracy designed to strip a perfectly sane woman of her legal autonomy and steal her financial assets. I am stepping forward today as a fully cooperating witness for the federal government." He reached out and sliced through the thick red evidentiary tape sealing the first box. He pulled out a massive, meticulously tabbed binder and dropped it heavily onto the judge's bench. "This first volume," Dominic stated with lethal, uncompromising precision, "contains the complete unredacted banking records for Dr. Eris Thorne. It details exactly 3 offshore wire transfers, totaling $500,000, routed through a Cayman Islands shell company, controlled entirely by Patricia and her husband Richard. The final payment cleared the doctor's account yesterday morning. They specifically purchased the perjured testimony he just delivered to this court." Dr. Thorne physically recoiled. The color drained completely from his face, leaving him a sickly, chalky white. He scrambled down from the witness stand, his clinical arrogance entirely evaporating. He frantically looked toward the rear exits, but the heavy oak doors remained firmly shut. Dominic moved down the line, placing his hand on the next stack of sealed boxes. His voice rang with methodical, devastating clarity. "The rest of these boxes contain a decade's worth of undeniable, catastrophic proof of federal financial crimes committed by the entire family structure. For 10 long years, they have operated a sprawling, highly illegal network of wire fraud, egregious corporate tax evasion, and international money laundering. I have personally handed over every hidden ledger, every offshore account number, and every forged signature. I have provided the impenetrable paper trail demonstrating exactly how Patricia and Richard systematically drained their own corporate holdings, hid the stolen assets overseas, and then attempted to use this sham conservatorship as a desperate final cash grab to cover their impending federal indictments." Patricia collapsed backward into her chair. Her meticulously maintained facade of the grieving, concerned mother shattered into a million irreparable pieces. She grabbed her attorney's sleeve, whispering frantically, pleading for him to do something. But the lawyer was already pulling away, shoving his files into his leather briefcase, his face pale as he realized he was standing in the epicenter of a massive, heavily orchestrated federal sting operation. He wanted absolutely nothing to do with them. Rachel was hyperventilating. She clutched her chest, her eyes darting around the room with a feral, trapped panic. The sheer magnitude of Dominic's betrayal, the total and complete destruction of her marriage, her hoarded wealth, and her personal freedom crashed down on her all at once. She opened her mouth to scream, to deny the accusations, to hurl insults at the man she had married, but no words came out. She was suffocating on the ashes of her own unparalleled greed. The judge flipped open the first heavy binder. His eyes quickly scanned the highlighted bank statements and the explicitly detailed wire transfers linking the corrupt doctor directly to the petitioners. His face darkened into a mask of pure, unadulterated judicial fury. He slammed the binder shut with a resounding crack that made everyone in the room jump. "Dr. Thorne." The judge bellowed, his voice echoing fiercely off the vaulted ceiling. "Do not take another step toward that door. You are to remain exactly where you are until you are taken into custody." The judge then turned his furious, piercing gaze toward Patricia Rachel and their scrambling, cowardly attorney. I have never in my entire career seen such a blatant, disgusting abuse of the judicial system. The judge declared, his voice dripping with absolute contempt. This entire petition is a malicious criminal fabrication. The temporary conservatorship request is instantly and permanently struck from the record. This court is formally dismissing all claims against the defense with extreme prejudice. The judge picked up his wooden gavel, but he did not strike the sounding block to adjourn. Instead, he looked over the heads of the petitioners and gave a sharp, definitive nod toward the back of the room. That was the final signal. The heavy oak doors burst open again, this time with explosive, terrifying force. 24 heavily armed federal agents swarmed into the courtroom. They wore dark tactical vests emblazoned with the bright yellow letters of the FBI. They flooded the center aisle, moving with rapid, highly coordinated military precision. They bypassed the stunned gallery entirely and formed a tight, inescapable physical perimeter around the petitioner's table. The lead agent, a tall, imposing woman with cold, uncompromising eyes, stepped directly in front of Rachel. At the exact same moment, 2 more heavily armored agents hauled Richard, who had been sitting quietly in the back row of the gallery, desperately attempting to slip away unnoticed in the chaos, roughly to his feet. Rachel and Richard, the lead agent, announced, her authoritative voice slicing clearly through the pandemonium of the courtroom. "You are both under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, severe federal tax evasion, and perjury." Rachel let out a piercing, entirely unhinged shriek as the cold steel handcuffs snapped brutally around her wrists. She kicked and thrashed against the agent, screaming Dominic's name, cursing his existence, and begging him to stop them. Dominic simply turned his back on her, adjusting his tailored suit jacket with chilling, absolute indifference. Richard, pale and sweating profusely, offered no resistance at all as the federal agent secured his arms behind his back, his posture entirely defeated by the weight of his crimes. The FBI agents forcefully marched Rachel and Richard down the center aisle. Rachel's frantic protests and high-pitched wails echoed loudly against the marble walls as they were hauled out of the courtroom. The heavy doors swung shut behind them, leaving Patricia sitting entirely alone at the petitioner's table, trembling and paralyzed completely, surrounded by the towering boxes of evidence that had sealed her family's ultimate doom. Patricia sitting entirely alone at the petitioner's table, trembling and paralyzed completely, surrounded by the towering boxes of evidence that had sealed her family's ultimate doom. The heavy mahogany doors of the courtroom clicked shut, sealing away the screaming, the panic, and the final remnants of the people who had once claimed to be my blood. The gavel had fallen, the federal indictments had been executed, and the deafening silence that followed their erasure stretched continuously into the next calendar year. 12 months later, the world had shifted entirely. I was no longer fighting for my autonomy in a sterile downtown Manhattan courthouse. I was standing in the opulent, impenetrable security of the private coastal estate Alexander and I had constructed on the edge of the Hamptons. It was late October, and a brutal, torrential downpour was raging outside. The sky above the Atlantic Ocean was a bruised, violent purple, and heavy horizontal sheets of freezing rain hammered against the floor-to-ceiling reinforced glass windows of the primary living room. The wind howled furiously off the water, whipping the manicured coastal grass into a frenzied, chaotic blur. Inside, the climate-controlled environment hummed with quiet atmospheric perfection, the massive stone fireplace radiating a steady, comforting heat across the polished imported marble floors. Outside, in the violent deluge, a completely ruined, destitute figure was dragging himself up the mile-long, crushed stone driveway. It was Bradley. The man who had once paraded around New York high society in bespoke Italian suits and flashed a platinum corporate card was now entirely unrecognizable. His clothes were soaked through, torn at the knees, and elbows plastered tight to a gaunt, sickly, and malnourished frame. The former corporate titan had been reduced to a literal vagrant. He had somehow managed to bypass the outer security gate, slipping through the heavily monitored perimeter during a brief chaotic window when the automated sensors were temporarily disrupted by the severe electrical storm. He stumbled forward blindly, his ruined shoes slipping on the wet stones, falling hard to his hands and knees before forcing himself back up. The freezing rain plastered his thinning, unkempt hair to his skull as he limped relentlessly toward the glowing warmth of the estate's rear patio. He reached the elevated limestone deck and threw his entire body weight against the heavy tempered glass doors. His wet, filthy hands slapped against the pane, leaving muddy, desperate streaks across the flawless, transparent surface. He banged his fists frantically against the glass, his mouth moving in rapid, silent pleas that were completely obscured by the roaring, deafening wind. I stood in the center of the living room, a cup of hot chamomile tea resting lightly in my hands, watching him with absolute clinical detachment. Alexander was overseas on business, leaving me alone with the estate's private security staff. But I did not signal the armed guards waiting in the monitoring wing. I did not press the silent panic button. Instead, I calmly set my teacup down on the kitchen island. I walked deliberately toward the entrance, manually disabled the biometric lock, and pushed the heavy glass door open, stepping out onto the expansive covered porch. The freezing moisture of the storm instantly hit my skin, but I remained perfectly sheltered beneath the grand architectural overhang, wearing a floor-length, pristine white cashmere lounge dress. Bradley collapsed the absolute second the door opened. He fell hard onto his knees in the freezing, churning mud that was pooling rapidly at the base of the porch steps. He did not even attempt to stand. He simply knelt in the wet dirt, weeping with loud, jagged, uncontrollable gasps that tore painfully through his throat. The rainwater poured down his haggard face, mixing freely with his pathetic, desperate tears. He stared up at me, his eyes bloodshot, sunken and wild with a terrifying hollow panic. He began to babble, his voice raw, raspy, and broken, completely stripped of the arrogant, condescending cadence he had wielded like a weapon for years. He told me that he had lost absolutely everything. He screamed over the sound of the cracking thunder that Courtney had systematically bled his accounts dry, that she had ruthlessly manipulated the media against him, and that she had leveraged his remaining offshore assets to save herself before leaving him entirely bankrupt and radioactive to every financial institution on the eastern seaboard. He sobbed his chest, heaving violently under his ruined shirt, swearing to me that he had been blind. He cried out that Courtney had poisoned his mind, that she had orchestrated every betrayal, and that every single mistake he had ever made during our marriage was entirely her fault. Then his frantic, mud-soaked apologies shifted into a deeply calculated, sickeningly familiar routine. He looked up at me through the pouring rain, his face twisted in a pathetic mask of manufactured devotion. He swore, his voice cracking with artificial emotion, that he still loved me. He choked out the words, claiming that through the total destruction of his life, the public humiliation, and the absolute loss of his empire, the only clarity he had found was his absolute, undeniable love for me. He cried out that I was the only pure, genuine thing he had ever known, begging me to look past his current ruin and see the man I had once chosen to marry. He dragged his shivering body forward through the thick, freezing sludge, closing the final physical gap between the muddy yard and the pristine limestone step where I stood looking down at him. He reached out with a trembling, filth-covered hand, his fingers stretching desperately upward to grab the pristine white hem of my cashmere dress. As his muddy fingertips hovered mere inches from the expensive fabric, he looked up with a hollow, pleading gaze, actively trying to weaponize the ghost of our past. He invoked the memory of the rainy night we first met in college, whispering brokenly about the quiet campus library, the shared cups of cheap coffee, and the innocent, naive dreams we had mapped out together before the money and the greed had infected him. He tried to summon the ghost of that young, foolish girl who had once loved him unconditionally, utilizing our most sacred, untouched memories as a psychological crowbar to pry open my pity and manipulate me into saving him one absolute final time. I stepped back, Just a single measured inch. His muddy, trembling fingers grasped at empty air, missing the pristine white hem of my cashmere dress by a fraction of a second. His hand dropped, splashing heavily back down into the freezing, churning slush at the base of the limestone steps. He stayed frozen in that pathetic kneeling posture, his face tilted upward into the brutal driving rain, waiting for the lifeline he was absolutely certain I would throw him. He was waiting for the naive, endlessly forgiving woman he had married a decade ago to reach down, pull him out of the muck, and meticulously piece his shattered life back together. I looked down at the shivering, broken shell of the man I had once thought I would spend the rest of my existence with. I searched my heart and mind for a single flicker of emotion. I actively looked for a trace of anger, a lingering shadow of sadness, a sudden spark of vengeance, or even the smallest, most pathetic shred of pity. There was absolutely nothing. The internal void he had created the day he betrayed me, the gaping wound he had caused when he conspired with my mother and sister to orchestrate my ruin, had long since been filled with genuine love, relentless ambition, and unyielding strength. He had gambled his entire existence on the assumption that my empathy was a weakness he could eternally exploit, but he was catastrophically wrong. I did not raise my voice over the roaring, howling coastal wind. I did not need to. I spoke with a glacial quiet and absolute certainty that cut straight through the violent storm and struck him with physical force. "I don't hate you, Bradley," I stated, my voice echoing with a lethal mechanical calm. "Because to hate someone, they have to matter. You are just a mistake I made at 26, and I've already cleaned you up." He stared up at me, his jaw trembling violently, the realization finally breaking through the dense, impenetrable layers of his lifelong narcissistic delusion. The psychological manipulation had failed entirely. The theatrical weeping and the weaponized college memories held absolutely zero currency here. He finally understood that he had not just lost his wealth, his reputation, and his social standing. He had permanently lost his access to me. He was completely irreversibly erased from my reality. I turned my back on him. I did not hesitate, I did not waver, and I did not offer a single lingering glance of sorrow or regret over my shoulder. I crossed the elevated limestone deck, the soft, heavy cashmere of my lounge dress sweeping flawlessly over the threshold. I reached out and grabbed the heavy brass handles of the reinforced glass and oak doors, pulling them shut with a smooth, effortless motion. The heavy automated biometric locks engaged instantly with a loud, definitive metallic click. The roaring, chaotic sound of the coastal storm, his muffled pleading wails, and the freezing rain were instantly severed, entirely blocked out by the thick architectural glass. He was locked outside in the cold, permanently exiled to the dark, muddy ruin he had so meticulously built for himself. I turned away from the glass and walked deeper into the grand, expansive living room, the ambient, climate-controlled warmth wrapping around me like a protective, impenetrable shield. The contrast between the violent, freezing destruction outside and the absolute perfect peace inside was profound. The massive floor-to-ceiling stone fireplace was roaring, casting a brilliant golden and dancing glow across the polished imported marble floors and the rich dark wood accents of our sanctuary. Alexander had returned early from his overseas business trip. He was sitting at the low, custom mahogany table in the center of the room, patiently and lovingly guiding our son Leo through the intricate, complex opening moves of a chess game. Leo laughed, a bright, pure, and joyous sound that echoed beautifully through the high vaulted ceilings as Alexander praised his clever, unexpected strategy. Alexander looked up from the carved wooden pieces, his sharp, powerful gaze meeting mine with an unspoken, infinite understanding. He did not ask who was at the door. He did not need to. He simply smiled, a genuine, completely unguarded expression reserved exclusively for his family. Across the room, nestled in the plush, oversized leather armchairs by the fire, Dominic was leaning back, looking more relaxed than I had ever seen him. A rare, entirely genuine smile illuminated his face as he shared a quiet joke with his new partner. She was a brilliant, fiercely successful, and uncompromising venture capitalist who matched his razor-sharp intellect and deeply respected his unyielding loyalty. She laughed, her hand resting comfortably on Dominic's arm, a picture of true, authentic partnership built on mutual respect rather than manipulation and parasitic greed. I walked over and took a seat on the soft velvet sofa directly next to my husband and my son. Alexander reached out his warm, strong hand enveloping mine, his thumb gently tracing the smooth band of my wedding ring. Leo proudly showed me his captured chess pieces, his eyes shining with innocence and absolute security. I sat there surrounded by my real family, the family I had actively chosen, meticulously vetted, and fiercely protected. The immense, undeniable power of cutting toxic, parasitic ties washed over me in a wave of pure, unadulterated peace. It is not enough to simply survive the people who actively try to destroy you. You must completely eradicate their influence, revoke their access to your energy, and build an impenetrable fortress of boundaries around your life. When you finally realize your own fundamental worth, the people who relentlessly relied on your perceived weakness will entirely lose their power over your future. Share your own stories of establishing unbreakable boundaries and reclaiming your life in the comments below. Tell me how you found the strength to sever ties with toxic partners or manipulative family members who tried to drag you down with them. Detail the moment you finally recognized your own value and built a reality they no longer had access to. If my journey of absolute resilience and ultimate vindication resonated with your own experiences, hit the like button and subscribe for more stories of surviving betrayal and emerging completely victorious. The most profound lesson from this narrative is that true liberation begins the moment you stop trying to heal people who repeatedly break you. Madeline's journey beautifully illustrates that, while empathy is a tremendous strength, it becomes a dangerous vulnerability when offered to those who merely seek to exploit it. By firmly closing the door on Bradley's manipulative, desperate apologies, she demonstrates that setting absolute boundaries isn't an act of cruelty, it is the ultimate act of self-preservation. Real family and genuine love are built on mutual respect and unwavering support, not parasitic obligation. Share your own experiences of cutting toxic ties and reclaiming your peace in the comments below.